There is a ledge of sandstone above the waterline at Sydney Harbour, worn smooth in a way that stone does not wear smooth on its own. The surface has been worked, the grooves are too regular, too deliberate, too deeply cut into material that resists carving, and they have been there long enough that the edges have softened and the colour has shifted to match the surrounding rock, rather than standing out from it the way fresh cuts do. The people who arrived in January of 1788 would have seen this ledge. Some of them would have touched it, some of them would have run a finger along the groove and felt the depth of it, and understood at some level below language that they were not the first. The official story of Sydney begins in 1788. That is the year Arthur Phillip sailed 11 ships into the harbour that would become one of the most recognisable in the world, and the year that British colonial history declares the city to have begun. The records from that period are meticulous in some ways, and deeply selective in others, and the image they present of a vast, untouched wilderness waiting to be civilized and named and built upon has been repeated so many times over 2.5 centuries that it has come to feel like geological fact rather than political narrative. But stone does not lie in the way that documents can. Stone records what actually happened to it, and the sandstone of the Sydney Basin has been recording things for a very long time. This is a slow look at what was already here, not the kind of look that rushes toward a conclusion or demands that you accept a particular version of the past, but the kind that simply follows the evidence where it leads and sits with what it finds. The kind of look that takes the time that the subject deserves, because what was here before 1788 took tens of thousands of years to build, and it does not owe its explanation to anyone's schedule. We are going to move through 9 things, 9 pieces of the picture that the official account of Sydney's founding leaves out, or minimises, or explains away with language that sounds confident, but dissolves quickly when you push against it. Each of them, taken alone, is interesting. Taken together, they suggest something that the standard timeline of Sydney's history cannot easily accommodate. The harbour was already named when the British arrived, not by the British, but by the people who had been living on its shores for longer than most other human civilizations have existed. The Gadigal people called it Cadi, they called the harbour Wockenmagley. They had words for every inlet and headland and bay, and those words had been passed down through generations too numerous to count, which means the landscape had been known and organised and spoken about and remembered across a span of time that makes 1788 feel like yesterday. This is where the real history of Sydney begins. Not with a flag planted in the sand, but with the question of what the sand was already holding when the flag arrived. If you're settling in for this, then get comfortable. Let the weight of what we are about to consider settle around you like the sandstone itself, which has been settling for 250 million years and is in no hurry about any of it. This is the kind of history that rewards patience. The kind that opens slowly, like the harbour itself when you come around the heads for the first time and the full width of the water appears in front of you, and you understand, without anyone telling you, that this place has always been significant. The question is not whether something was here before 1788. The question is how much and how old, and why the official account has been so reluctant to say so clearly. Before we go into all of that, if this is the kind of history that speaks to you, take a moment right now and subscribe. And turn on notifications so this channel finds you when new videos arrive. Leave a comment below telling us where in Australia you are watching from, or where in the world, because this history belongs to more than one country and more than one conversation. We read every single one. Now, let us begin at the beginning, which is much further back than 1788. The number 65,000 is difficult to hold in the mind. Human beings are not wired for numbers that large when they refer to years. We process centuries with some difficulty and millennia with considerable effort, but 65,000 years exists outside the range of intuitive understanding for most people, and that difficulty is part of why it gets treated as a footnote rather than a headline. But 65,000 years is where the story of Sydney actually begins. In 2017, a team of archaeologists published findings from the Majid Baby Rock Shelter in the Northern Territory that pushed the confirmed date of human habitation in Australia back to at least 65,000 years before the present. The evidence they found included the oldest ground edge axe technology in the world, the earliest evidence of grinding stones used to process seeds, and the oldest known use of ochre for what appears to have been ritual or artistic purpose. These were not the signs of a people who had just arrived and were figuring things out. These were the signs of a people who had been here long enough to develop sophisticated technology, to refine it, to teach it across generations, and to build a culture that used it with purpose. 65,000 years ago, the Neanderthals had not yet disappeared from Europe. The first anatomically modern humans had only recently left Africa. The city of Jericho, often cited as one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on Earth, would not exist for another 55,000 years. The entire span of written human history, from the first Sumerian cuneiform tablets to the present moment, would fit inside the last 6% of the time Aboriginal Australians had been living on this continent. The Sydney Basin sits at the southeastern edge of this continental story. The Gadigal people, the Cadigal as they are sometimes rendered, inhabited the southern shores of Port Jackson, and the Camaragal lived on the northern shores. And between them and around them were the dozens of clan groups who together formed the broader Eora people of the coastal region. Their languages were related but distinct. Their territories were defined and understood. Their relationships with the land and the water were not incidental to their culture but constitutive of it, meaning that the land and the people were not separate things to be described independently, but were aspects of a single continuous reality that had been developing its complexity for longer than any other human civilization on Earth. What does 65,000 years of occupation look like on the land itself? It looks like landscape management on a continental scale. The mosaic burning practices of Aboriginal Australians, the deliberate use of fire to shape vegetation patterns, maintain travel corridors, encourage the growth of food plants, and manage animal habitats, produced a landscape so thoroughly altered by human intention that the early European explorers who described it as pristine wilderness were making a profound misreading. What they were describing as untouched was in fact the product of millennia of careful management. The forests of the Sydney Basin were not accidental. The spacing of the trees, the distribution of species, the presence of certain plants near water sources, these were the results of human choices accumulated across thousands of generations. It also looks like architecture. This is the part that the standard historical narrative tends to elide. The assumption, rarely stated explicitly but deeply embedded in colonial historiography, was that Aboriginal people had no architecture, no permanent structures, no built environment worthy of the name. This assumption is wrong, and it was wrong at the time it was made, and the people who made it knew it was wrong because some of them wrote down what they actually saw. In Victoria, in the southwestern corner of the continent, there is a place called Budj Bim. The Gunditjmara people built an aquaculture system there using volcanic stone that is now understood to be at least 6,600 years old, making it older than the Egyptian pyramids by approximately 2,000 years. The system includes channels, weirs, dams, and holding ponds that were engineered to manage the flow of water and the movement of short-finned eels, which were harvested, smoked, and traded across enormous distances. It is, by any reasonable standard, a feat of hydraulic engineering. It was recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2019. In the same region, permanent stone houses have been identified and dated. Not temporary shelters, but permanent structures with walls, sleeping areas, and in some cases arrangements that suggest their functions were organized in specific ways. When the explorer Thomas Mitchell passed through the Western District of Victoria in 1836, he wrote of encountering Aboriginal villages that he described as covering more ground than many towns in England. The Brewerina fish traps on the Barwon River in New South Wales are widely considered to be among the oldest human constructions on Earth, possibly 4,000 years old or more, consisting of a series of interlocking stone weirs and pools that could trap fish in enormous quantities across multiple seasons and water levels simultaneously. They are an engineering achievement of considerable sophistication, requiring an understanding of water flow, fish behavior, stone placement, and seasonal variation that could only have been developed through generations of accumulated observation and refinement. None of this happened far from Sydney. These were the people of the Sydney Basin's extended cultural world, connected by trade routes, by kinship networks, by the sharing of knowledge across the continent. What was built in Victoria and along the river systems of New South Wales speaks to the capacity that existed in the same cultural tradition that shaped the land around what is now Sydney Harbour. When Arthur Phillip arrived in 1788, he was not arriving at an empty shore. He was arriving at the terminal point of a civilization 65,000 years in the making, one that had built and managed and shaped and named every feature of the landscape he was sailing through. The harbour he named Port Jackson already had a name. The cove he chose for the settlement already had a history so deep it extended below any horizon he could have imagined. The sandstone he built on was already carved. The question is not whether the Aboriginal civilization of the Sydney region was sophisticated. It demonstrably was. The question is why the depth and permanence and architectural reality of that civilization was so comprehensively written out of the founding narrative of the city that grew up on top of it, and what happens when you start looking at what was left behind in the stone. The sandstone of the Sydney Basin is a particular kind of rock. It is Hawkesbury sandstone, formed from sediments deposited approximately 250 million years ago during the Triassic period, and it has a quality that makes it uniquely suited to a certain kind of record keeping. It is hard enough to resist casual weathering, but soft enough to be worked with the right tools. It holds an edge. A groove cut into Hawkesbury sandstone 2,000 years ago is still a groove today. Still readable, still carrying whatever meaning was placed into it by the hands that made it. The Sydney Basin contains one of the densest concentrations of rock art in the world. Tens of thousands of individual engravings, paintings, and arrangements have been documented across the region, and researchers who work in this area are consistent in saying that the known sites represent only a fraction of what actually exists. The National Parks and Wildlife Service estimates that more than 5,000 rock engraving sites have been recorded in the Sydney Basin, a number that grows each year as survey work continues. The Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park, on the northern outskirts of what is now the city, contains some of the most extensive and well-preserved of these engravings. Walking the tracks through that bush, you come upon figures cut into the flat sandstone surfaces that are as large as life-size human forms, and animals rendered with an anatomical accuracy that speaks to intimate, sustained observation, and geometric shapes that do not correspond to any animal or human form, but whose regularity suggests intention and meaning. Whales, sharks, kangaroos, emus, human figures with their arms raised, fish, spirals, lines that extend across meters of flat rock and seem to connect one image to another in ways that researchers are still working to understand. The Elvina track engraving site is among the most significant. On a large, flat sandstone platform above a sheltered valley, the engravings include figures that are larger and more formally arranged than most, and among them are shapes that do not fit easily into the category of natural representation. There are concentric circles. There are parallel lines that run in directions that appear to align with solar events. There is a whale that is carved with such precision that researchers have used it to identify the exact species depicted, and the arrangement of the figures around it suggests that this was not a casual production, but a considered one, placed in relationship to one another according to principles that we do not yet fully understand. What is striking about the Ku-ring-gai engravings is their scale and their consistency. These are not isolated scratches made in passing. They required time, planning, and effort. The sandstone surfaces were prepared before carving began. The lines are cut to a consistent depth that indicates the use of specific tools applied with deliberate pressure. Some of the larger engravings cover areas of 20 or 30 square meters and would have required hours of sustained work to complete. The landscape has been chosen with care. The flat platforms on which the engravings appear are not random outcrops, but specific elevated positions with particular orientations, often facing east, often with clear sightlines to the horizon or to particular geographic features. The interpretation of the engravings is a subject of ongoing and, at times, contentious scholarly discussion. Aboriginal knowledge holders are the primary authorities on the meaning of their cultural heritage, and the elders of the relevant clan groups have maintained connections to these sites across the centuries in ways that official colonial history repeatedly attempted to sever, but never fully succeeded in severing. What the knowledge holders say about the engravings, to the extent that it has been shared publicly, is that they are not decorative. They are not primitive art in the diminishing sense that 19th century commentators use that phrase. They are records. They are instructions. They are maps of a kind that does not require coordinates, because it operates on a different understanding of space and time than the one that navigational charts are based on. But there is another layer of what the engravings tell us, one that sits alongside the cultural knowledge of the people who made them and does not contradict it but adds to it. The physical evidence of the engravings tells us about the civilization that produced them in the way that any construction project tells you about its builders. It tells you about the organization of labor. It tells you about the transmission of technical knowledge. It tells you about the prioritization of effort across a community's resources. Creating thousands of large-scale engravings on prepared sandstone surfaces across a region the size of the Greater Sydney Basin does not happen casually. It requires that someone, across many generations, decides this is important enough to do and continues doing it. It requires the passing of skills from older carvers to younger ones. It requires the maintenance of sites over time, the returning to them, the addition to them, the protection of them. It requires, in other words, a society with enough surplus capacity beyond immediate survival to devote significant energy to cultural production of a sustained and technically demanding kind. This is not the description of a society that is struggling to exist. This is the description of a society that has solved the problems of existence well enough to invest in something beyond them. In the Darug and Ku-ring-gai communities, who are the custodians of much of this rock art, the engravings are understood as a living connection to country, to the ancestors who made them, and to the knowledge systems that the images encode. That understanding has survived 236 years of colonial pressure, including the destruction of sites, the removal of people from their country, the suppression of language, and the systematic attempt to replace Aboriginal knowledge systems with European ones. The fact that the knowledge has survived at all is itself a form of evidence about the depth and resilience of the civilization that carries it. When you stand at one of the Ku-ring-gai engraving sites on a still morning and look at the figures cut into the rock, there is a quality of presence that is not easy to explain in purely analytical terms. The whale is there on the stone, and it has been there for longer than Australia as a nation has existed, and it will be there long after everything built in the last 236 years has returned to dust or been rebuilt or been forgotten. The stone remembers things that documents do not. That is the second thing to understand about what was already here when 1788 arrived. The art was here. The records were here, the meaning was here. The city that grew up on top of this sandstone built its streets and its buildings and its institutions without asking what was underneath them, and the rock has been holding its answer in patience ever since. About 80 kilometres north of Sydney, in the bushland of the Central Coast region, there is a valley in the Brisbane Water National Park where the sandstone walls carry something that has been generating argument among historians, archaeologists, and independent researchers for decades. Cut into the rock face in two locations are inscriptions that, to a trained eye familiar with ancient Egyptian writing systems, look unmistakably like hieroglyphs, not vaguely similar to hieroglyphs, not suggestive of hieroglyphs in the way that abstract marks might be construed to resemble almost anything if you look at them the right way. These are characters that correspond to specific identified glyphs in the Egyptian writing system, arranged in sequences that follow the structural logic of ancient Egyptian text, including the directional conventions that indicate how the text is meant to be read. The Gosford glyphs, as they have come to be known, were brought to wider public attention in the 1990s and have been the subject of fierce controversy ever since. The official position of Australian archaeology is that they are a hoax carved in modern times by someone with an interest in generating mystery and confusion, and that the proper response is to dismiss them and move on. This position is stated with considerable confidence, and it rests on arguments that are worth examining in detail because the arguments are not as strong as the confidence with which they are delivered. The primary argument for hoax is that ancient Egyptians did not reach Australia. This argument is, in the strictest logical sense, circular. It begins with the conclusion that ancient Egyptians did not reach Australia, and uses that conclusion as evidence against any finding that would suggest they did. It does not engage with the physical evidence of the glyphs themselves. It does not address the question of weathering, of the depth and patina of the cuts, of the orientation of the inscriptions relative to the surrounding rock surface. It simply states that the presence of Egyptian hieroglyphs in Australian sandstone is impossible, and therefore any apparent hieroglyphs in Australian sandstone must be fraudulent. The secondary argument is that the glyphs contain errors, inconsistencies, and anachronisms that expose them as the work of someone who was imitating Egyptian writing without fully understanding it. This argument has more substance, but it is complicated by the fact that ancient Egyptian writing systems changed significantly over approximately 3,000 years of use, that regional and period variations existed within the system, and that the specific scripts and conventions used at different times and places are still incompletely understood by modern Egyptologists. The identification of an error in ancient Egyptian inscription requires a level of certainty about the correct form of the inscription that scholars are not always in a position to provide. In 2011, an Egyptologist named Mohammed Ibrahim and a researcher named Abdel Hakim Awian offered an interpretation of the Gosford glyphs that generated significant attention and significant pushback. Their translation proposed that the glyphs were a memorial inscription recording the death of an Egyptian expedition that had reached Australian shores and become stranded, and that the tomb they described as being cut into the rock nearby was the burial site of a young Egyptian nobleman named Nefertiru, the son of a pharaoh they identified as Khufu of the 4th dynasty. The translation was detailed and internally consistent, and was described by its authors as straightforward Egyptian hieroglyphics of the type used during the Old Kingdom period, approximately 4 to 4,500 years ago. This interpretation was rejected by mainstream Egyptology. The rejection was swift and comprehensive, and in some cases it was not gentle. The researchers were accused of incompetence and fabrication. The translation was described as a product of wishful thinking. The sites themselves were described as certain hoaxes that deserved no further scholarly attention. But here is what the rejection did not do. It did not produce a detailed, character-by-character analysis of the inscriptions demonstrating specifically how and why the translation was wrong. It did not commission independent geological analysis of the patina and weathering of the cuts to establish their age. It did not identify a specific individual or group responsible for the alleged hoax, or provide evidence of when in the modern era the carvings were made, or explain how such an elaborate and technically proficient carving could have been executed on a steep sandstone cliff face in a remote national park without leaving any trace in historical memory or record. The weathering question is not trivial. Sandstone weathers at a measurable rate. The depth of a cut, the extent to which the edges have rounded, the degree to which the exposed surface has developed a patina matching the surrounding uncut rock, these are quantifiable characteristics that can indicate the age of an incision with reasonable confidence. A carving made in 1990 looks different from a carving made in 1890, which looks different from a carving made in 1490, which looks different from a carving made 4,000 years ago. Several independent researchers who have visited the Gosford sites and examined the inscriptions in person have described the weathering as inconsistent with a 20th century origin. No study commissioned by official archaeological or heritage bodies has been published that directly addresses this question using the full range of available dating techniques. The broader context for the Gosford glyphs is a question that academic archaeology treats as settled, but that the evidence continues to complicate, which is whether ancient maritime cultures had the capacity to reach Australia before European contact. The Brewerina fish traps include stones that have been identified as non-local in origin, transported from distances of hundreds of kilometers. Trade goods of demonstrably distant origin appear in archaeological sites across the continent. The Macassan traders of what is now Indonesia are known to have been visiting the northern coast of Australia for hundreds of years before 1788. The coast of Australia facing Southeast Asia is not an impenetrable barrier, but a series of islands and shallow seas that experienced navigators have crossed for millennia. The possibility that an ancient maritime culture with exceptional navigational knowledge might have reached Australian shores in the distant past is not, in the context of what is known about ancient maritime history generally, inherently implausible. It is the kind of question that deserves investigation rather than dismissal, and the Gosford glyphs are, at minimum, an invitation to that investigation. Whether the inscription is what its interpreters claim or something else entirely, the sandstone of the Central Coast continues to hold its secret with the same patient indifference it has maintained for the duration of the argument about it. The stone does not mind being controversial. The stone has been here longer than the controversy, and will outlast it by a considerable margin. In the archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, there are maps. They were made by Portuguese and French cartographers in the mid-16th century, primarily between 1530 and 1566, and they are known collectively as the Dieppe maps, named for the Norman port city, where many of the cartographers who produced them worked. The maps are sophisticated documents, beautifully illustrated and technically accomplished, and they show, among other things, a large landmass in the southern hemisphere, whose outline, in certain respects, bears a resemblance to the eastern coast of Australia. The landmass is labelled Java le Grand on several of the maps. It occupies a position south and east of the Spice Islands, in roughly the correct part of the globe for Australia, and its size, while distorted in the manner of all pre-modern cartography, is consistent with a continental landmass rather than an island. Its coastline, in the sections that appear most detailed, has features that correspond to recognizable geographic landmarks on the Australian coast, including what some researchers have identified as representations of the Gulf of Carpentaria, Cape York Peninsula, and the coastline of eastern Australia below it. If these maps are what some researchers have argued they are, which is a cartographic record of a Portuguese expedition that surveyed the Australian coast at some point in the early 16th century, then European knowledge of Australia predates James Cook's voyages by approximately 250 years, and the narrative of European discovery that underpins the legal and historical justification for British colonisation of the continent is not what it has been presented as. This is a genuinely contested historical question. The mainstream position of academic cartographic history is that Java le Grand is not Australia, that the resemblance is coincidental or the result of cartographers filling in unknown territory with imaginative constructions, and that there is no credible documentary evidence of a European voyage to Australia before the Dutch contacts of the early 17th century. This position has significant scholarly support and is based on careful analysis of the cartographic conventions of the period, but it has not gone unchallenged. Kenneth Gordon McIntyre, an Australian diplomatic historian and scholar, spent years researching this question and published his findings in 1977 in a book called The Secret Discovery of Australia, which made the case that a Portuguese expedition under Cristóvão de Mendonça had surveyed the eastern coast of Australia in approximately 1522, and that the Dieppe maps were based in part on the charts produced by that expedition. McIntyre's argument was methodical and drew on extensive archival research. He compared the coastal features of the Dieppe maps with actual Australian geography in detail, and found correspondences that he found difficult to explain by coincidence. He traced the provenance of the maps and identified the cartographic traditions from which they emerged in ways that supported a Portuguese rather than purely fictional origin for the Australian coastline depicted. The mahogany ship is an element of this story that has resisted easy dismissal. Near the town of Warrnambool on the coast of Victoria, multiple witnesses across the 19th century reported the remains of a vessel of unusual construction, partially buried in coastal sand dunes. The vessel was described as being of different design from the European ships of the colonial period, with timbers of a dark, dense hardwood not native to the region. It was reportedly visible on several occasions during the 19th century, when shifting sands exposed it, and at least 3 expeditions were launched in the early 20th century to locate it again without success. No confirmed physical remains have been recovered, but the consistency of the witness descriptions across different decades, and the agreement on certain specific features of the wreck, has kept the mahogany ship in the category of unresolved historical questions rather than dismissed legend. Oral traditions of Aboriginal communities along the Victorian coast include accounts of contact with outsiders before British arrival. The specifics vary by community and by the custodians of the tradition, but the general content of these accounts describes strangers arriving by sea in large vessels at some point in the pre-colonial past. These traditions were documented by early colonial observers, which means they exist in the historical record. not only in contemporary oral transmission. For the history of Sydney specifically, the implications of pre-British European contact are significant in a particular way. If European navigators were surveying the eastern coast of Australia in the early 16th century, then the question of what they observed and described takes on new dimensions. If there were already structures visible from the water, if there were fires in the night visible from offshore, if there were organized settlements distinguishable from casual camping sites, then the records of such an expedition, if they exist and have not been destroyed or suppressed, would contain information about Sydney Harbour as it appeared to an outside observer 2.5 centuries before 1788. The Portuguese, for reasons of commercial secrecy and imperial strategy, were deeply reluctant to share geographic information about new territories they had surveyed or claimed. The deliberate destruction or suppression of maps and voyage records was standard practice in the period. If an expedition had surveyed the Australian coast in the early 16th century, the records would have been classified. They may have been destroyed. They may still exist somewhere in Portuguese or Vatican archives in forms that have not yet been fully investigated. The possibility is not evidence of the fact, but it is a reason for a kind of historical humility that the official account of Sydney's founding does not always demonstrate. The maps were here before the flags were here. Whether they were Portuguese or French or something else entirely, the making of a map is evidence of a presence. And the presence came before the naming, and the naming came before the building, and the building is what we call the beginning. The Hawkesbury River runs roughly 50 kilometres north of Sydney, cutting through a landscape of sandstone gorges and dense bushland before broadening into a wide, tidal estuary and emptying into the Tasman Sea. It is one of the most beautiful river systems in New South Wales, and its sandstone cliffs and dense forest give it a quality of permanence and age that feels appropriate for a place where the following story is set. The story begins with bones. Over the course of the 19th century, in the period of intensive European settlement and agricultural development of the Hawkesbury River region, a number of accounts accumulated in local correspondence, newspaper reports, and the personal journals of settlers and surveyors that describe the discovery of skeletal human remains of unusual size. The reports were not systematic. They were scattered across different locations, different decades, and different observers. But they shared a consistent core element, which was that the bones described were larger than those of the Aboriginal people living in the area at the time, larger than those of the European settlers, larger in ways that struck the observers as significant enough to record. The most frequently cited of these accounts relates to discoveries near the Hawkesbury River itself. Bones described as belonging to individuals of very large stature were reportedly found in caves and in alluvial deposits along the river system. The accounts are fragmentary and in some cases second-hand, which makes their evaluation difficult, and in the absence of physical specimens or precise documentation of their discovery context, they exist in the space between historical record and folk memory. The Moonbai people, whose country is in the New England region north of Sydney, maintained oral traditions that included accounts of a race of large people who had inhabited parts of eastern Australia in the past. These traditions were recorded by early anthropologists and colonial officials, and exist in the documentary record, though they have been given little weight by mainstream archaeology, which is understandably cautious about incorporating oral traditions that describe anomalous physical characteristics as evidence for specific prehistoric populations. The difficulty with evaluating claims of unusual skeletal remains from this period is not simply the absence of physical evidence. It is also the complicated history of what happened to physical evidence in the 19th century when it contradicted prevailing theories about human prehistory. The Smithsonian Institution in the United States has been the subject of extensive historical research, suggesting that skeletal remains from archaeological contexts that did not fit accepted narratives about the peopling of the Americas were systematically removed from their discovery contexts and placed in storage where they were not accessible to further study. Similar processes occurred in Australia, where the colonial authorities and later the National Museum establishment accumulated Aboriginal skeletal remains, under circumstances that are now acknowledged to have been ethically compromised in multiple ways. The absence of physical evidence for anomalous skeletal remains in the Hawkesbury region does not therefore establish the absence of such remains. It establishes only that the remains, if they existed, are not currently available for study. These are different statements with different implications. What the geological and archaeological record of the Hawkesbury region does clearly indicate is very long-term human occupation, with characteristics that suggest a more complex human story than the simple narrative of continuous Aboriginal habitation, unchanged from the distant past to 1788. The river system shows evidence of dramatic landscape change over the past 10 to 20,000 years, including significant sea level rise that submerged a substantial portion of the coastal plain on which earlier populations would have lived. The sandstone caves of the region contain stratified deposits that have not been fully excavated. The engravings found in this region include some that differ in style from the main Ku-ring-gai tradition, in ways that researchers have not fully explained. The Hawkesbury region was also the site of the most sustained and violent resistance to European colonisation of any area in New South Wales. The Darug and Darkinjung people of the region conducted what historians now describe as a prolonged guerrilla campaign against the colonial expansion into their territory between approximately 1795 and 1816, a period known as the Hawkesbury and Nepean Wars. The intensity of that resistance speaks to the depth of the connection between these people and this land, and to the significance of what was being defended. People do not fight with that ferocity for land that has no history. They fight for land that is full of history, land that contains their dead and their knowledge and the evidence of everything their people have been. The bones that the settlers reportedly found in the sandstone country of the Hawkesbury may have been exactly what the accounts described, or they may have been misidentified or misremembered or embellished in the transmission. But the question of what lies in the caves and alluvial deposits of that sandstone country, what the full archaeological story of the region would look like if it were investigated with the resources and rigor that comparable sites in Europe and the Middle East routinely receive, is still genuinely unanswered. The Hawkesbury River is patient, the sandstone is patient. The caves along its shores have been holding whatever they hold for a very long time, and they will continue to hold it until someone asks the right questions with the right tools in the right spirit. Beneath the streets of Sydney, there is another city. This is not a metaphor. In the sandstone bedrock beneath the central business district, beneath the Victorian terraces of inner Sydney, beneath the parks and squares and the foreshore pathways that tourists walk in the mornings, there are tunnels. Some of them are documented and mapped and known to the authorities that maintain the infrastructure of a modern city. Others are less well documented, discovered during construction projects, and sealed again because the schedule of a building project does not permit the extended investigation that what was found would ideally have warranted. The story of underground Sydney is partly the story of water management, because the tank stream was the reason the settlement was placed where it was. Arthur Phillips selected the cove that became Sydney Cove specifically because it had access to fresh water in the form of a small creek that ran through the low ground behind the shoreline. That creek, the tank stream, became the central water supply for the early colony, and the tanks cut into the sandstone along its course to hold and distribute water gave it its name. The tank stream is still there beneath the city, now enclosed in a culvert and carrying storm water rather than fresh water, running from its origins near Park Street to Circular Quay, where it enters the harbour. But the tank stream is not the only channel in the sandstone below central Sydney. During construction projects across the central business district over the past century, builders and engineers have reported encountering cut-stone channels, carved passages, and chambers in the sandstone that predate any documented colonial construction. The interpretations of these discoveries have generally been conservative, attributing them to early colonial works that are poorly documented in the historical record, rather than to any pre-colonial agency. This attribution may be correct in many cases. The early colonial period involved an enormous amount of informal and undocumented construction, as a population of convicts and soldiers built a settlement under conditions of urgency and resource scarcity that did not always permit systematic record keeping. But some of the discoveries are more difficult to attribute to the early colonial period. During the construction of the MLC Centre in the 1970s, workers encountered a system of cut sandstone passages at a depth inconsistent with colonial-era construction. The discovery was noted, some documentation was made, and the project continued. During excavations for the expansion of the Museum of Sydney in the 1990s, layers of occupation were found beneath the foundations of the first Government House site that extended deeper than the colonial period accounts for, with artefacts and material culture present in lower strata that required explanation. The official interpretation was that the material had been disturbed and deposited by later colonial activity, which is possible, but which is also the kind of interpretation that is easiest to make when extended investigation is not available. The Hyde Park Barracks excavations are more thoroughly documented and are worth spending time with because they demonstrate what is possible when systematic archaeology is applied to Sydney's urban fabric. When the barracks were being converted to a museum in the late 1980s, archaeologists had the opportunity to excavate the site in detail, and what they found extended the occupation history of that ground back beyond the colonial period into a landscape that had been shaped by its Aboriginal inhabitants before any British person arrived. The post holes, hearths, and material debris of Aboriginal occupation were present in the lower stratigraphic layers, and the way the landscape had been used and modified by Aboriginal people before the barracks were built on top of it was recoverable from those lower layers. The Hyde Park Barracks excavation is important not only for what it found, but for what it demonstrated about what had been routinely destroyed without investigation in the construction of the colonial and post-colonial city. Every time a building was demolished and a new one built, the upper layers of urban archaeology were disturbed or removed, taking with them the evidence that would have allowed the earlier occupation history to be reconstructed. This process has been going on for 236 years. The city has been, in effect, continuously erasing the record of what was here before it, not deliberately in most cases, but structurally, as a consequence of the way cities grow and rebuild on their own foundations. The tunnel tradition and Aboriginal culture of the Sydney region is not well documented in the academic literature, but it exists in various forms in the oral traditions of the relevant communities, and in the accounts of some early colonial observers. The Gadigal people and their neighbours were intimately familiar with the sandstone landscape, including its caves and overhangs and the passages that form naturally in certain geological formations. The distinction between a natural passage modified by human use and a constructed passage is not always easy to draw, and in a sandstone landscape where the rock can be worked with relative ease, the boundary between natural and artificial features can be genuinely ambiguous. What is clear is that the city of Sydney was built on, over and through a landscape that had been shaped by human hands for thousands of years before the first colonial shovel went into the ground, and that the evidence of that shaping has been incompletely recorded at best and deliberately ignored at worst, and that what lies beneath the streets of the modern city is a palimpsest, a document written over and over on the same surface, in which the earlier inscriptions are still present if you know how to read through the more recent layers. The tunnels beneath Sydney are not, in themselves, evidence of any single dramatic discovery. They are evidence of continuity, of the enduring presence of human intention in the sandstone, reaching back through the colonial period into the depths of the pre-colonial landscape where the timescales become difficult to navigate with our ordinary sense of what history means. Water is the measure of a civilization, not in the sense that more sophisticated civilizations use more water, but in the sense that the way a people manages water tells you more about their practical intelligence and their understanding of their landscape than almost any other indicator. The great ancient civilizations, from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley to Egypt to the Anasazi of the American Southwest, are remembered and studied in part because of what they built to control and distribute and store water. And those hydraulic works were not incidental to their achievements, but central to them. The Aboriginal civilizations of Australia were water managers of the first order, and this is one of the most thoroughly underappreciated facts about the continent's pre-colonial history. We have already discussed the Brewarina fish traps on the Barwon River, which are believed to be among the oldest human constructions on Earth. But the Brewarina traps are one element of a continent-wide tradition of hydraulic engineering that operated at scales ranging from individual creek modifications to landscape-level water management systems of extraordinary sophistication. The Budgebim Aquaculture Complex in Victoria, built by the Gunditjmara people at least 6,600 years ago, includes stone channels that were engineered to direct the flow of water from the seasonally flooded wetlands of the Conda area through a system of weirs and pools in ways that maintain populations of short-finned eels for harvesting throughout the year and across varying seasonal conditions. The engineering of this system required an understanding of hydrology, of the relationship between rainfall, runoff, and wetland extent that could only have been developed through generations of systematic observation. The Gunditjmara did not stumble upon an effective fishing method and repeat it. They designed a system, adjusted it over time, and operated it continuously for millennia. Similar, if less extensively documented, water management systems existed throughout southeastern Australia, including in the region that became Sydney. The coastal estuaries of the Sydney region, including the harbours and inlets of Port Jackson and Botany Bay and the river systems that fed them, were managed environments in the pre-colonial period. The Eora people maintained fish traps and weirs at specific points in the estuary systems that concentrated fish for harvesting. Some of these structures were still visible in the early colonial period and were described by First Fleet officers and later by colonial-era observers. Governor Phillip himself noted the presence of fish traps in the harbour in his early dispatches, describing them as evidence of the indigenous inhabitants' understanding of the water and its resources. The specifics of what these water management structures looked like in the Sydney region are imperfectly documented. The colonial period involved both the physical destruction of indigenous infrastructure, as the settlers required clear land and access to water resources for their own uses, and the more diffuse destruction of knowledge, as the Aboriginal population was reduced by introduced disease and displaced from their country in ways that interrupted the transmission of practical knowledge about the landscape's management. What survives in the documentary record is a series of references in colonial-era accounts to structures in the landscape that the writers generally described without fully understanding. Fish traps that they saw and used without recognizing the engineering knowledge they embodied. Channels and cleared paths that they followed without recognizing them as constructed features. Landscape modifications that they attributed to natural processes because they had no framework for recognizing human agency in land management at the scale it was being exercised. In the Blue Mountains west of Sydney, where the sandstone plateau is cut by deep gorges and the water table is complex and variable, evidence exists of water management practices by the Darug and Gundungurra people that altered the hydrology of specific creek systems in ways that are still detectable in the landscape. The modification of certain creek beds with stone to slow water flow and encourage deep percolation into the sandstone is one example. The deliberate positioning of fire management regimes to influence the catchment characteristics of particular water sources is another. These practices were not incidental. They were part of an integrated system of landscape management that operated across the full extent of country, and that maintained the productivity of the land at a level that supported populations far larger than the post-colonial European narrative has generally acknowledged. Estimates of the pre-contact Aboriginal population of the Sydney region vary widely, but some demographic studies based on the carrying capacity of the managed landscape suggest figures significantly higher than the sparse nomadic population that colonial accounts implied. A population that size does not survive on an unmanaged landscape in the same way that a small, scattered population can survive without infrastructure. A population that size requires water management. It requires food production systems. It requires organization of resources at a scale that we would, in any other context, describe as sophisticated. The first fleet arrived and found fresh water in the tank stream. They noted it as a resource, claimed it, and proceeded to contaminate it with remarkable speed through poor waste management practices, so that by 1790 it was already compromised and alternative sources were being sought. The people they displaced had been managing that water source, and the wider catchment that fed it, for thousands of years without contaminating it. The contrast is instructive in ways that the standard historical account of the founding of Sydney tends to leave unexamined. The water was managed before 1788. The fish were managed before 78. The fire was managed. The landscape was managed. What the colonists found was not wilderness. It was a garden maintained by people who understood it in ways that the colonists did not and would not recognize for a very long time. The journals of the people who sailed with the first fleet are extraordinary documents. They are detailed, often perceptive, and occasionally breathtaking in the gap between what their authors described and what their authors understood. Reading them carefully, reading them with attention to what is mentioned in passing and not developed, to what is described without being analyzed, to what is noticed and then set aside, is one of the most illuminating exercises available to anyone who wants to understand what 1788 actually was and what was actually found there. Arthur Phillip's dispatches to Lord Sydney, the Home Secretary whose name he gave to the settlement, are formal documents and necessarily shaped by the political context in which they were written. Phillip was reporting to his superiors on the progress of a colonial enterprise that had specific objectives, and his descriptions of what he found are filtered through those objectives. He was not conducting an anthropological survey. He was establishing a penal colony and reporting on whether that enterprise was proceeding satisfactorily. The Aboriginal inhabitants of the land he was settling were, in his dispatches, primarily relevant as either a potential threat to or a potential resource for the settlement's success. But even within these constraints, certain observations emerge from Phillip's writing that repay attention. Phillip noted early on that the Aboriginal people of the harbour region had well-established paths through the landscape, paths that the settlers found useful and followed. He described the country as open in ways that suggested ongoing management, noting that the grass was short and the trees were well spaced in manners that facilitated travel. He observed that certain areas of the harbour and its hinterland were visited regularly by groups of Aboriginal people whose movements appeared to follow a systematic pattern rather than random search for resources. These observations, embedded in documents whose primary purpose was administrative rather than ethnographic, describe a managed landscape and an organized population. They describe, in other words, exactly what you would expect to find if you had arrived at a place that had been inhabited and managed for tens of thousands of years by people who knew it intimately. Watkin Tench is perhaps the most valuable of the First Fleet writers for the purposes of understanding what was already here. His two accounts of the settlement, a narrative of the expedition to Botany Bay and a complete account of the settlement at Port Jackson, are remarkable for their intellectual honesty and their genuine curiosity about the Aboriginal people and culture he was observing. Tench was a marine officer, not an anthropologist, but he brought to his observations a quality of attention that many trained observers lack. He was interested in what he saw. He tried to understand it rather than simply categorize it. Tench described Aboriginal social organization in ways that, if taken seriously, would significantly complicate the image of a small, scattered population of primitive hunter-gatherers that colonial historiography eventually settled on. He described clear social hierarchies. He described specialists within the community, including what he identified as individuals with specific knowledge functions, comparable to the surgeons and priests and engineers of European society. He He described trade goods and exchange relationships that implied connections to communities far beyond the harbour. He also described structures, not grand architecture in the European sense, and Tench was careful and accurate in his descriptions, but permanent modifications of the landscape that served specific social functions. Cleared areas that appeared to be maintained gathering places, arrangements of stones that marked territory or served ceremonial purposes, fish traps in the harbour that he identified as constructed features, the track network through the bush that the settlers found so useful that they widened and formalised it into the roads they needed. David Collins, the judge advocate of the settlement, produced a 2-volume account of the colony published in 1798 and 1802 that remains one of the primary documentary sources for the early colonial period. Collins was more legalistic than either Phillip or Tench, and his observations of Aboriginal culture are filtered through a legal and administrative sensibility, but they contain details of Aboriginal social organisation, land tenure, and territorial definition that describe a system considerably more structured than the terra nullius legal fiction required. Terra nullius was the doctrine that declared Australia legally empty of people with rights of ownership or sovereignty over the land, allowing the British Crown to claim it as unoccupied territory. This doctrine was the legal foundation of the entire colonial enterprise, and it required that the Aboriginal inhabitants of Australia be characterised as people without law, without property, without governance, and without the kind of organised social relationship with the land that would give them rights under international law. The journals of the First Fleet writers repeatedly describe evidence that contradicts this characterization, and this contradiction was not accidental. The journals were not widely read or influential in shaping the legal and political decisions that determined the future of the continent. What Phillip and Tench and Collins described, read carefully and in its full context, is a society that had organised its relationship with the Sydney landscape over an immense span of time in ways that produced a functional, sophisticated, and stable human ecology. They did not describe wilderness. They described a place that had already been, in the most meaningful sense of the word, built. The building they described did not look like London. It did not have stone walls and glass windows and numbered streets. But it was building nonetheless, the accumulated work of generations of people who understood their environment with a depth and precision that the people who arrived in 1788 did not possess and would not develop for many generations if they developed it at all. The journals are still there. They are available in libraries and online archives, readable by anyone who chooses to read them. They have been sitting there for 236 years, describing what was found, waiting for readers who would pay attention to what they actually say, rather than to the story that was later constructed from selective excerpts of what they said. On a basalt plain in the Western District of Victoria, in a place called Wurdi Yawang, there is a stone arrangement that has been drawing the attention of researchers for several decades. It consists of roughly 100 basalt stones arranged in an ovoid shape approximately 50 metres across, with spurs of stones extending from the western arc of the oval in directions that point toward the positions of the setting sun at the summer solstice, the winter solstice, and the equinoxes. The Wathaurong people are the traditional custodians of Wurdi Yawang, which they know as a significant cultural site. Researchers from the University of Melbourne and CSIRO who examined the site in the 2000s published findings suggesting that the astronomical alignments were intentional and precise, concluding that the arrangement was designed by people with a systematic knowledge of solar movements across the year and the capacity to encode that knowledge in stone in ways that could be read and used across generations. If the interpretation of Wurdi Yawang is correct, it places Aboriginal Australians among the earliest known creators of intentional astronomical observatories, potentially older than the megalithic stone circles of Europe that have received vastly more scholarly attention. The date of construction of Wurdi Yawang is not firmly established, but estimates based on the surface condition of the stones and their relationship to the surrounding landscape suggest they have been in place for thousands of years. Wurdi Yawang is not an isolated example. The tradition of astronomical knowledge in Aboriginal Australia is the oldest continuous astronomical tradition on Earth. This is now a mainstream statement in the history of science, not a fringe claim, supported by research from institutions including the Australian National University and the University of Southern Queensland, and published in peer-reviewed academic journals. The Burong people of northwestern Victoria possessed a detailed star catalogue, maintained in oral tradition and recorded by European observers in the 19th century, that identified and named individual stars, star clusters, and nebulae, described their properties and movements, and embedded them in a cosmological framework that explained their relationship to one another and to events on Earth. Some of the celestial observations recorded in the Burong tradition describe features of the night sky with a precision that was not achieved in European astronomy until the age of the telescope. The identification of the Eta Carinae Nebula as a feature that varied in brightness, recorded in Burong tradition as the behaviour of a particular ancestor being, was not confirmed by European observational astronomy until the 1840s, when John Herschel noted the variation from his observatory in South Africa. For Sydney specifically, the astronomical tradition of the Eora people is less completely documented than that of some other communities, partly because of the intensity of the disruption that the early colonial settlement caused to the Aboriginal population of the harbour region. But what has been recovered and reconstructed through the work of Aboriginal knowledge holders and researchers who work with them reveals a sophisticated astronomical culture that was intimately connected to the management of the natural environment. The orientation of the rock engravings at sites like Ku-ring-gai and the Darowal country south of Sydney has been examined by researchers looking for astronomical alignments, and some alignments have been proposed and discussed, though the evidence is not always conclusive, and the interpretation of rock art sites requires care to avoid projecting patterns onto evidence that is genuinely ambiguous. But the tradition of solar and celestial orientation in the construction of significant cultural sites is well established in Aboriginal culture generally, and there is no reason to suppose that the Sydney region was exceptional in this regard. The Murramarring people of the south coast, whose country extends down from the southern edges of the Sydney Basin, maintained astronomical traditions that were documented in detail in the early colonial period by observers who recognized their sophistication without fully understanding their context. The timing of particular fishing and gathering activities by the positions of specific stars is one element. The use of star positions to navigate the coast is another. The identification of particular star configurations with the seasonal availability of particular food resources represents a form of applied ecology encoded in astronomical observation, and it is a form of knowledge that took thousands of years of systematic attention to develop. In the Blue Mountains west of Sydney, certain elevated positions that offer clear views of the western horizon are associated in Aboriginal tradition with specific times of year, defined by celestial events. The mountains were not simply a barrier or a resource zone in the Aboriginal understanding of the landscape. They were an astronomical horizon, a place from which the sky could be read in ways that informed the management of the coastal country below them. The full extent of the astronomical tradition of the Sydney region's Aboriginal people has not been systematically documented. The disruption of community and culture over the past 2 centuries has made the recovery of detailed astronomical knowledge difficult, and what has been recovered is largely the product of the dedicated work of individual knowledge holders and the researchers who work with them, rather than any institutional program of systematic documentation. But the tradition exists. It has persisted through 2 centuries of determined suppression and neglect, and it speaks to a relationship between the people of this landscape and the sky above it that is as deep and as carefully maintained as any aspect of their relationship with the land itself. The sky was read here before 1788. The stars were named and tracked and understood in ways that served real practical purposes. The knowledge that allows you to know where you are and what season it is, and when the fish will run and when the fire should be lit, was encoded in the night sky and maintained across generations in oral traditions of extraordinary precision and durability. That knowledge was here when the first fleet arrived, operating in the minds and memories of every elder in every community around the harbour, and it continued to operate through the colonial period even as everything around it was being dismantled. The sky has not changed since 1788. The stars are in the same positions relative to the horizon as they were when the Eora people first named them. The alignments that were built into the rock art and the stone arrangements are still readable by anyone who knows how to look. The knowledge has not gone away. It has been waiting, like the stone, like the harbour, like the deep time of the continent itself, for the moment when the people who came in 1788 and their descendants are finally ready to ask what was already there when they arrived. The soil beneath Sydney has been accumulating for longer than the city has existed, and within it are layers that tell the story of what happened here with a kind of uneditable precision that no documentary record can match. Soil does not have reasons to be diplomatic. It does not have political pressures that shape what it records. It simply absorbs what falls into it and holds it in the order in which it arrived, building up a stratigraphy that trained archaeologists can read the way a geologist reads a cliff face, as a sequence of time that can be measured and dated and interpreted. The archaeological stratigraphy of the Sydney Basin has been examined in detail at a relatively small number of sites where construction projects or heritage investigations have created the opportunity. What those investigations have found, consistently, is occupation that extends further back and runs deeper than the standard historical narrative of Sydney tends to acknowledge, and a pattern of land use and cultural activity whose complexity increases rather than decreases as you move further back in time. The Cadigal burial grounds that were known to exist in the early colonial period near the settlement have never been systematically excavated with modern archaeological techniques. Colonial-era construction disturbed and in many cases destroyed them, and the remains that were recovered during construction in various periods of Sydney's development were not consistently treated with the care and documentation that would have allowed their contents to be fully understood. This represents a significant gap in the archaeological record of the harbour region, because burial sites are among the most information-rich archaeological contexts available. They contain not only skeletal material that speaks to population health, diet, and genetics, but also material culture objects whose typology and style can be dated and compared across sites, and whose arrangement relative to the deceased can reveal information about social organisation, belief systems, and cultural continuity. The absence of this information is not the same as the absence of the people and the practices it would have documented. In the sites that have been properly investigated, the depth of occupation revealed by stratigraphic analysis is substantial. The site of the first government house, excavated during the development of the Museum of Sydney in the late 1980s and early 1990s, produced occupation evidence extending below the colonial layers into the pre-contact period, with charcoal deposits that yielded radiocarbon dates suggesting use of the site well before 1788. The lowest stratigraphic layers had not been fully exposed before the construction schedule required the excavation to close. Similar patterns appear at other excavated sites around the harbour: charcoal from hearths, flaked stone artefacts, ground ochre, shell-midden material, and the traces of post holes from structures that left no surface evidence. These are the constituents of the archaeological record that the sandstone and soil of Sydney have been preserving since long before any ship sailed through the heads. The chemistry of the soil at certain sites in the Sydney region tells a story about land use that complements the stratigraphic evidence. Anthropogenic soil, soil that has been substantially altered by long-term human presence, has distinctive chemical signatures including elevated phosphorus from organic waste, carbon deposits from sustained fire use, and pH modifications from the accumulation of shellfish remains and the leaching of ash over long periods. These signatures have been identified at multiple locations around the harbour in ways that indicate sustained, intensive occupation at specific sites over time periods considerably longer than the colonial period. The fire-modified landscape of the Sydney region is legible in the pollen record, preserved in sediments from wetlands and lakes within the basin. Pollen analysis from sites around Sydney shows a pattern of vegetation change that corresponds to deliberate fire management, with the composition of the vegetation shifting in ways that indicate systematic burning at intervals and intensities consistent with the mosaic burning practices that are documented in Aboriginal land management traditions. The earliest of these fire management signatures in the local pollen record extends back thousands of years, describing a landscape that was being actively managed at the time when the earliest human occupation of the region was being established. The geological context adds another dimension. The Sydney Basin sits in a region of complex hydrology and geology shaped by the interplay of the Sandstone Plateau, the river systems, and the dramatic sea level changes of the late Pleistocene and Holocene. When sea levels were lower than today, which they were for most of the period of human occupation of the continent, the geography of the Sydney region was significantly different. The harbour itself did not exist in its current form until approximately 10,000 years ago, when rising seas flooded the drowned river valley that is now Port Jackson. The land on which early people lived and which their cultural activities took place across most of the period of Australian human occupation is now underwater. This means that the archaeological record of Sydney's deep history is predominantly inaccessible in the way that any underwater site is inaccessible compared to a terrestrial one. The stories of the 30,000 or 40,000 or 50,000 years that preceded the drowning of the harbour are preserved primarily in the elevated sandstone country that remained above sea level and in the oral traditions of the people whose ancestors walked across a coastal plain that is now the floor of the Tasman Sea. The soil layer is patient. It contains everything that has fallen into it and stayed there, and the processes of decay and preservation have been selective in the way that geology is always selective, preserving some materials and destroying others, but preserving enough that a careful reader can reconstruct something of the sequence of human presence in this place from the accumulation of microscopic evidence that no act of colonial construction or administrative suppression has been able to entirely erase. What the soil says is that Sydney was built on an inhabited landscape of great depth and complexity, that the inhabitants had been shaping and managing that landscape across an immense span of time, and that the act of building the colonial city on top of that landscape was not the beginning of Sydney's story, but a very recent chapter in a history whose earlier pages are still there, waiting under the streets, holding their information in the patient, uneditable way that soil and stone always do. The Blue Mountains are visible from Sydney on a clear day. They rise to the west, a blue wall of plateau and escarpment that early colonists found impassable for more than 2 decades before Gregory Blaxland and William Lawson, and William Wentworth crossed them in 1813 and opened the inland to European expansion. The blue haze that gives the mountains their European name comes from the oil droplets released by the eucalyptus trees that cover them, and on still days the haze accumulates in the deep valleys and gorges, in ways that make the distances difficult to judge and the landscape feel both close and unreachably far. The Darug people of the coastal plain and the Gundungura people of the mountains had been moving through this landscape for tens of thousands of years before any European thought to attempt it. They knew it in the way that you know a place when your relationship with it is measured in generations, and you have been learning its specifics since before you could walk, passed down through memory and story and direct instruction, in a continuous chain of knowledge that extends back to the first human who stepped into the gorge country and decided it was worth understanding. In the Blue Mountains sandstone country, there are stone arrangements that fall into the category of things that are hard to explain if you assume, as the standard historical narrative has generally assumed, that pre-colonial Aboriginal society in this region consisted of small, mobile groups without the social organisation to undertake large-scale constructional projects. The arrangements are found at elevated positions throughout the mountains, typically on exposed sandstone platforms or ridgelines with extensive views across the surrounding landscape. They consist of stones moved from their natural positions and placed in patterns that suggest intentional design. Some of the arrangements are relatively modest in scale. Others are large enough and formally organised enough to have attracted the attention of researchers who study the tradition of stone arrangements in Aboriginal Australia. The problem with studying these arrangements is the same problem that attends much of the archaeological heritage of the Sydney region, which is that the documentation has been sporadic, the interpretive framework has often been inappropriate, and the tradition of knowledge that would allow the arrangements to be understood in their original context has been disrupted in ways that make reconstruction difficult. Aboriginal knowledge holders who are familiar with the cultural significance of certain sites in the mountains are not always in a position to share that knowledge publicly, for reasons that include the sacred nature of the information and the practical reality that sharing detailed knowledge about the location of significant sites increases the risk of damage or inappropriate access. What researchers have been able to document is that the pattern of stone arrangements in the Blue Mountains is consistent with a tradition of landscape marking that served multiple functions. Some arrangements appear to be boundary markers, defining the edges of territories or the limits of areas associated with specific clans or knowledge traditions. Some appear to be navigational markers, placed at points where route decisions need to be made. Some appear to have ceremonial functions related to the initiation and teaching systems that were a central feature of Aboriginal social organisation throughout eastern Australia. The Bora Rings of the Sydney Basin and its western hinterland are among the most formally organised and widely documented of the ceremonial landscape features. A Bora Ring consists of two circular earthworks connected by a cleared pathway, typically oriented in a specific direction. The larger circle was the site of public ceremonial activity. The smaller circle was restricted to initiated men. The pathway between them represented a threshold. The whole arrangement encoded in its geometry a specific understanding of the relationship between the uninitiated and the initiated, the public and the sacred, the known and the knowable. Bora rings were constructed at specific locations in the landscape that were chosen according to criteria that included the suitability of the ground, the acoustic properties of the site, the relationship of the site to the surrounding landscape features, and the proximity to water and other resources that would allow large gatherings to be sustained over the multi-day ceremonial periods for which they were used. Their construction required the coordinated labour of groups large enough to move the earth into the ring formations, and their use required the assembly of people from a wide area. They were, in other words, infrastructure for a social system that operated at a regional rather than a local scale. In the Sydney Basin, Bora rings have been identified and documented at multiple locations. Some were destroyed by colonial agriculture and construction before they could be fully recorded. Others have survived in protected areas. The distribution of the known sites suggests that the ceremonial network they served was extensive, connecting communities across the full extent of the basin and linking into similar networks that extended throughout the southeastern region of the continent. The knowledge that the Bora rings encoded was not local knowledge. It was continental knowledge, shared across the continent through ceremony and through the trade and communication networks that connected Aboriginal communities from the coast to the desert and from the tropical north to the temperate south. To participate in the ceremony conducted at a Sydney Basin Bora ring was to participate in a shared knowledge system whose nodes were distributed across an area larger than Europe. This is the scale at which Aboriginal civilization operated. Not at the scale of individual bands moving through local country, as colonial historiography preferred to imagine it, but at the scale of a continent-wide knowledge system maintained by thousands of communities through networks of ceremony and exchange and communication that required and demonstrated a level of social organization far beyond what the terra nullius legal doctrine was prepared to acknowledge. The stone arrangements of the Blue Mountains are one physical expression of this continental scale organization. They are the hardware, in the contemporary sense of the term, of a software system of knowledge and social practice that was running continuously across the continent when the First Fleet arrived, and that, despite 2 centuries of intensive effort to shut it down, has never fully stopped running. The mountains are still there, the stone is still there. The arrangements are still readable by the people who know how to read them, and they are still doing what they were always doing, which is holding the knowledge that was placed in them in the form of physical marks on the landscape, waiting for the right readers to come back to them. One of the most important and least discussed facts about pre-colonial Australia is that it was connected, not connected in the way that a modern transport network connects places, with fixed infrastructure and scheduled services and a central administrative authority, but connected in the deeper and more resilient way that living networks are connected, through relationships, through reciprocal obligations, through the movement of goods and people and knowledge along pathways that existed in the land and in the memory of the people who used them. The trade networks of pre-colonial Australia are not a new discovery. They have been documented by ethnographers and archaeologists for well over a century, and the evidence for them is spread across museum collections, archival records, and the archaeological sites of the continent. What has been less consistently acknowledged is the scale and sophistication of what these networks represent and what they imply about the society that maintained them. Stone axes from quarries in specific locations in central Queensland have been found at archaeological sites in Victoria and South Australia. Ochre from particular mines in the Flinders Ranges travelled across the continent to communities who valued its specific colour and quality for ceremonial and artistic purposes. Pearl shell from the waters of the northwest coast has been found at sites in the deserts of central Australia, thousands of kilometres from any ocean. Pitchery, the preparation made from the native tobacco plant of the arid interior, was traded in the opposite direction, moving from the inland communities who processed it to the coastal communities who valued it. The mechanisms of this trade were sophisticated. Some goods moved through chains of exchange in which each party traded with their nearest neighbours, and the goods accumulated the distance of many such exchanges, without anyone necessarily making the full journey. Other goods moved with ceremonial travelling parties who had the rite of passage through multiple territories, because they were carrying out obligations that transcended the boundaries of any single group. The paths along which these goods and people moved were not random. They were specific routes, known and maintained and named, that followed the contours of the landscape in ways that reflected accumulated knowledge of water sources, food resources, and the territories of the communities through which they passed. The Sydney region sat at one edge of this continental network, its coastal communities connected to the broader system through the inland groups and through the coastal trade routes that ran along the eastern seaboard. The harbours and estuaries of the coast were nodes in a maritime exchange network that connected communities from Cape York to Bass Strait. Goods and knowledge and people moved along this coastal corridor in patterns that required both the navigational knowledge to use the sea safely and the social knowledge of who held what rights and obligations at each point along the route. The canoes of the Eora people were purpose-built for the harbour and the ocean beyond it. They were made from bark, stripped from specific trees at specific times of year, to produce the right combination of flexibility and waterproofing, and formed into shapes that the makers understood from long experience would perform correctly in the conditions of the harbour and the coastal waters. The canoe-building knowledge was specialised and was transmitted within families and clan groups as a significant body of technical knowledge. The canoes that the First Fleet officers observed in the harbour in 1788 were not primitive watercraft. They were the product of a boat-building tradition refined over thousands of years for the specific conditions of the specific waters in which they were used. The food exchange networks of the Sydney region are documented in the early colonial accounts in ways that suggest a level of organisation and regularity that sits uncomfortably with the image of dispersed autonomous bands. Tench and Collins both describe large gatherings at specific times of year when fish were running or particular plants were fruiting, gatherings that brought together people from a wide area in organised events that were simultaneously social, ceremonial, and economic. The fish traps and the cleared gathering areas around them were the physical infrastructure for these events, and the organisation required to run them, to manage the distribution of the harvest, to resolve the social and territorial issues that arose when many groups came together, required exactly the kind of social complexity and leadership capacity that colonial accounts generally denied Aboriginal society possessed. The trade in knowledge was perhaps the most significant form of exchange, and the least visible to colonial observers who did not recognize the transmission of specialized knowledge as a form of economic activity because it did not resemble their own market-based models. Medical knowledge, astronomical knowledge, geological knowledge of where specific materials could be found, ecological knowledge of the behavior of animals and plants, navigational knowledge of routes through unfamiliar country, all of these were traded and transmitted through the same networks that moved physical goods across the continent. In the Sydney region, the intersection of coastal ecological knowledge with the inland knowledge systems of the Blue Mountains communities created a pool of combined understanding that allowed the Eora people to exploit their environment with a sophistication that was not matched by any subsequent occupant of the same landscape until the development of modern ecology as a scientific discipline in the 20th century. They knew which plants flowered when and where. They knew which fish ran in which season and at what tide. They knew the behavior of the weather systems that moved off the ocean and through the harbour in specific seasonal patterns. They knew the rock and the soil and the water in ways that took tens of thousands of years to develop, and that cannot be reconstructed in 2 centuries. The trade networks that kept this knowledge circulating and refreshing and growing are among the most significant achievements of pre-colonial Australian civilization, and they are invisible to anyone who is looking for the physical infrastructure of exchange rather than understanding that the primary infrastructure was always human. It lived in the minds and bodies and social relationships of the people who maintained it, and when those people were displaced and dispersed and killed in the early colonial period, the networks did not entirely disappear because the people did not entirely disappear, but they were damaged in ways that have taken generations to begin to repair. The goods that moved along those networks left their trace in the archaeological sites at either end of their journeys. The pearl shell and the ochre and the stone axes are still there in the ground and in the museum cases, still carrying the distance they traveled as evidence of a connected world that predated the connected world that arrived in 1788 and claimed to have discovered connection. Language is a civilization's most complex technology. It is the medium through which all knowledge is encoded and transmitted, the system that makes cumulative culture possible, the infrastructure of everything else a society builds. A sophisticated language is not an accident. It is the product of thousands of years of refinement, the accumulated solution to the problem of representing a complex world in a form that can be shared between minds. At the time of European contact, the continent of Australia was home to somewhere between 200 and 250 distinct languages, grouped into approximately 28 language families, with the Pama-Nyungan family covering approximately 90% of the continent and a dense cluster of non-Pama-Nyungan languages in the northern and northwestern regions. This is a linguistic diversity that is comparable to that of Europe in the pre-Roman period or of the Americas before contact, and it represents the product of tens of thousands of years of linguistic development in relative geographic isolation. In the Sydney region specifically, the languages of the Eora people formed a dialect chain across which the communities of the harbour and the surrounding coast and inland maintained communication while expressing distinct local identities. The coastal Darug of the Sydney Basin, the Darowal of the coast to the south, and the Darkinyung and Gundungura of the mountains to the west and southwest were linguistically related but distinct, with shared vocabulary and grammatical structures alongside features that marked community membership. The complexity of these languages is not a matter of academic debate. They are grammatically sophisticated systems with features that European linguists found puzzling when they first began to study them, because those features do not appear in European languages and required new analytical frameworks to describe. The inclusive and exclusive distinction in the first person plural, the capacity to distinguish between we that includes you and we that excludes you, which appears in Darug and many other Australian languages, is a grammatical feature that encodes a social reality with a precision that English and most European languages lack. The evidential systems of many Australian languages, grammatical markers that specify whether the speaker is reporting direct observation, inference, or hearsay, encode an epistemological precision that academic philosophy has only recently begun to value. The vocabulary of the Sydney languages reflects an environment known with extraordinary intimacy. There are specific words for the state of the harbour at different tidal stages, for the appearance of the sky at different points in weather systems, for the behaviour of fish at different seasons, for the growth stages of specific food plants, for the different qualities of different types of sandstone, for the conditions of the bush after different patterns of burning. This vocabulary was not assembled in a generation or a century. It represents the accumulation of experience encoded in language across a span of time that makes the colonial period look negligible. The loss of this vocabulary is one of the most significant and least acknowledged catastrophes of the colonial period. Language carries knowledge in ways that cannot be fully translated because many of the most important things that a language knows are in its structure rather than its content, in the relationships between concepts that the language encodes rather than in the individual words that represent those concepts. When you lose a language, you do not simply lose the words. You lose the ways of thinking that the words were the vehicles for, and those ways of thinking often encoded practical knowledge about the world that took millennia to develop, and cannot be reconstructed from first principles in any reasonable time frame. The language reclamation movement among the Aboriginal communities of the Sydney region has been one of the most significant cultural developments of recent decades. The Darug language has been partially reconstructed from early colonial word lists, from the linguistic analysis of the names and words that survived in the colonial record in various degrees of distortion, and from the oral traditions of community members who maintained fragments of their ancestral language through the colonial period. The process is painstaking and imperfect because the original language was not preserved in a form that allows complete reconstruction. But reconstruction is happening. The Darug Custodians Aboriginal Corporation and the researchers who work with them have made substantial progress in recovering and systematizing the language, and Darug is being taught to children in communities around Sydney, being spoken at public events and ceremonies, being used in the naming of places and institutions in ways that restore its presence in the landscape that it encoded. The language is not dead, it was severely damaged, but the damage was not complete. and the work of recovery is ongoing. And the fact that it is ongoing is itself a statement about the depth and resilience of the civilization that produced the language in the first place. The place names of the Sydney region that survive in the colonial and post-colonial record are windows into the linguistic knowledge system of the pre-contact Eora people. Woolloomooloo, Paramatta, Kirribilli, Manly, Toongabbie, Cabramatta, these and hundreds of others are Eora and Darug words that entered the colonial record because the settlers found them practically useful as geographic labels and retained them even as they systematically suppressed the language itself. Their retention is somewhat ironic and wholly appropriate. The city that the settlers built on Aboriginal land was named, in large part, in Aboriginal languages, and those names are still pronounced by tens of millions of people every day. A daily practice of linguistic connection to the pre-colonial world, whether or not the speakers are aware of it. What the language map tells us about the civilization it reflects is this: 250 languages, developed over tens of thousands of years, organized into families and dialect chains and linked by shared knowledge across a continent-wide network. These are the linguistic product of an immensely complex, geographically extensive, and temporally deep civilization. The people who spoke these languages were not living in a pre-linguistic state of nature. They were participating in one of the most sophisticated linguistic cultures the world has ever produced, and that culture was operating in its full complexity on the shores of the harbour that became Sydney. At the moment the first fleet sailed through the heads, the words were already here. The names were already here. The landscape was already named in languages that knew it better than any European language would know it for another 200 years, and in some respects knows it still. On the southern shores of Sydney Harbour, in the suburb of La Perouse, there is a headland that was named by French explorer Jean-François de Galaup, Comte de La Perouse, who arrived in Botany Bay in January 1788, just days after the British First Fleet. He stayed for 6 weeks, observing the British settlement with professional curiosity and a certain diplomatic ambiguity, and then sailed away into the Pacific, where his entire expedition disappeared and was not accounted for until the wreck of his ships was found on a reef near Vanikoro in the Solomon Islands 40 years later. La Perouse's visit is a footnote in Australian colonial history, but his journals, and the journals of the naturalists who sailed with him, contain observations of the Aboriginal people of the Botany Bay region that are independent of the British colonial perspective, and add another dimension to the record of what was found at Sydney when the Europeans arrived. The French observers described a people who were not bewildered by the arrival of strangers from the sea. They were wary, cautious, and in some cases willing to engage in exchange, but they were not astonished. This is a small but significant detail. People who have never seen ocean-going vessels and never encountered people from other cultures do not behave the same way as people who have an oral tradition of such encounters, who know that strangers sometimes come from the sea and that there are protocols for managing such encounters. The behaviour of the Botany Bay Aboriginal people in January 1788, documented by both the British and the French, is more consistent with the latter than the former. The contact history of the Sydney region is longer and more complex than the official founding date of 1788 implies. The Dutch navigators Abel Tasman and Dirk Hartog and Willem Janszoon had made contact with parts of the Australian coast in the 17th century. Moccasin traders from the Indonesian archipelago had been visiting the northern coast for centuries. The Dieppe maps suggest possible Portuguese contact in the 16th century. Whatever the truth of those earlier contacts, the Aboriginal people of the coast were not isolated from knowledge of the wider world in the way that the colonial founding mythology requires them to have been. The headland at La Perouse and the broader Kurnell Peninsula across the bay, where Cook landed in 1770, are now formally recognised as places of enormous cultural significance to the Gweagal and Bidjigal people, the southernmost communities of the Eora Nation. The significance predates the European contact that the Europeans commemorated there. The headlands and the bay were significant to the Aboriginal people, who named them and used them for generations before any European ship appeared on the horizon, and the act of Europeans landing there and naming things and claiming them did not replace or erase that prior significance. It simply added a layer on top of it. The archaeology of the La Perouse area includes shell middens of considerable age that document the intensive use of the bay and its resources by the Aboriginal communities of the South Shore over a very long period. Middens are one of the most reliable indicators of sustained organised occupation of a coastal location. They represent the accumulated refuse of many meals, consumed by many people across many generations, and they contain within them a datable record of what was eaten, and therefore, indirectly, of the marine environment as it existed at different points in the past. The La Perouse middens have been dated to several thousand years before present at their deeper levels, documenting an unbroken history of intensive marine resource use at this location across a span of time that makes the 236 years of the colonial period a very thin layer at the top. For the Gweagal specifically, the history of contact with the First Fleet has a particular weight because of what happened at that first encounter. on the morning of April 29, 1770, when James Cook brought the Endeavour into Botany Bay and put men ashore at the Canal headland, the Gweagal men on the beach threw spears to warn the strangers away. They were demonstrating clearly and in terms that any culturally competent person would have understood that this was their place and that the strangers were not welcome to enter without negotiating their presence. Cook's response was to have his men fire muskets at the Gweagal, wounding at least 2 of them. This was the moment of first contact between the British and the Aboriginal people of the Sydney region, and it established a pattern that would continue throughout the colonial period. The Aboriginal people of the region communicated, repeatedly and clearly, that this was their country and that the settlers' presence required negotiation. The settlers' response, repeatedly, and with escalating violence, was to treat that communication as irrelevant. What the Gweagal were defending on that beach in April 1770 was not simply their fishing grounds or their camping places. They were defending the accumulated heritage of tens of thousands of years, the knowledge systems and the social structures, and the landscape modifications, and the trade networks and the ceremonial obligations that constituted the civilization they had inherited and were responsible for passing on to their descendants. They understood what was at stake in a way that their attackers did not. The Gweagal elder Rodney Kelly, a descendant of the men who threw those spears on that beach, has spent years pursuing the return of the spears and artifacts that Cook collected that day, and that are held in the British Museum in London. His campaign is both a practical matter of cultural repatriation and a symbolic act of historical accountability. The spears are evidence. They are physical objects from the moment before 1788, made by hands that knew the land of Sydney for tens of thousands of years, and they are sitting in a glass case in London because the man who took them did not understand or did not care what they represented. The harbour was here before the harbour had a European name. The people who knew it were here before the people who named it arrived. The story of what they had built, what they knew, what they maintained, and what was taken from them is the story of Sydney that the sandstone has been trying to tell for 236 years. And it is a story that the sandstone will still be telling long after everything the colonial period constructed has been replaced by whatever comes next. In the decades following the establishment of the Sydney settlement, there was a period when the two worlds existed in proximity, however unequally, before the full weight of the colonial system began its work of displacement and dispossession. During this period, certain colonists, those who were curious rather than contemptuous, who made the effort to communicate and observe rather than simply to assume, recorded details of Aboriginal cultural knowledge and practice that constitute a documentary archive of immeasurable value. Among the most significant of these early observers was Bennelong, or more precisely, the record of Bennelong as produced by the colonists who interacted with him, and the knowledge that can be inferred from those interactions about the cultural world he came from. Bennelong was a Wangal man, his country comprising the south shore of the harbour around what is now Hunters Hill and the inner western suburbs. He was captured by Arthur Phillip in November 1789 as part of an attempt to establish a communicating relationship with the Aboriginal people, who had been largely avoiding the settlement since the mass death from smallpox that had devastated the harbour communities in 1789 and 1790. The smallpox epidemic, which swept through the Aboriginal population of the region with catastrophic speed and killed an estimated half or more of the total population in a matter of months, was one of the most significant demographic catastrophes in Australian history and one of the most under-acknowledged. Bennelong was taken to England with Phillip in 1792, spending 2 years there before returning to Sydney. He died in 1813 and was buried in a garden at Kissing Point in what is now Putney. The opera house that sits on the headland that carries his name in Sydney Harbour is the most visited tourist destination in Australia. His name and his story are among the most famous in Australian history, but the civilization he came from, the specific cultural world of the Wangal people of the Inner Harbour, has received far less sustained attention than the individual who represented it in the colonial record. What Bennelong's interactions with the colonial authorities reveal, in the journals and letters of the period, is a man operating simultaneously in two cultural worlds with a sophistication and a strategic intelligence that is consistently remarkable. He understood the colonial system well enough to use it. He maintained his relationships with his own people throughout the period of his association with the colonial authorities, operating as a cultural intermediary who served both communities' interests in ways that were not always aligned. His behavior was frequently described by colonial observers as unpredictable or inconsistent, which is what the behavior of a person navigating genuinely incommensurable value systems looks like when observed by someone who only understands one of the systems. What Bennelong represented, and what he returned to when he returned to Sydney from England, was a cultural system of such depth and complexity that 2 years in Georgian London did not displace it. He dressed in European clothes and drank rum and engaged with European social customs, and he also returned to his clan, renewed his obligations to his family and community, participated in ceremonies, and died in the cultural and spiritual context of the Wangal people whose country he was born on. The two things were not contradictory. They were evidence of a person whose cultural roots were deep enough to accommodate significant external pressures without losing their essential character. The medical and botanical knowledge of the Eora people is another dimension of the civilization that the early colonial observers documented in ways that repay careful reading. The first colonial surgeons were faced with conditions for which their standard medical practice was inadequate. The Australian environment presented plants, animals, pathogens, and physical conditions that European medicine had no specific knowledge of. Several of the early colonial surgeons, practical men who valued results over prejudice, made systematic efforts to learn what the Aboriginal people knew about the medical properties of the local plants and about the treatment of local conditions. John White, the Surgeon General of the First Fleet, documented a number of plant-based treatments used by the Aboriginal people of the harbour region that he found effective, and several of these were subsequently investigated by European botanists and found to have pharmacological properties consistent with the uses the Aboriginal people put them to. The knowledge of the local pharmacopoeia that the Eora people possessed was not superstition or coincidence. It was the product of generations of systematic observation and experimentation, accumulated and transmitted through the same oral knowledge systems that preserved astronomical knowledge and ecological knowledge and historical knowledge. The implications of this for our understanding of what pre-colonial Sydney was are significant. A society that possesses systematic medical knowledge, that can identify and prepare and apply remedies for a range of conditions with a success rate high enough that trained European surgeons find them worth incorporating, is not a society that is living at the edge of survival without the cognitive surplus to develop complex culture. It is a society that has solved the problems of survival well enough to investigate and systematize and transmit knowledge about the world beyond those immediate problems. The knowledge was here in January 1788. It was here before the ships arrived, and it was being used daily by the people who held it. The medical traditions, the botanical knowledge, the pharmacological understanding encoded in the oral traditions of the Eora people were the product of the same civilizational depth that produced the rock art and the trade networks and the language systems and the astronomical observations. Everything that the standard historical account of Sydney treats as absent before 1788 was in fact present, not in the forms that the colonial eye was trained to recognize, but present in forms that were in many respects more sophisticated and more adapted to the specific conditions of the place than anything that the colonists brought with them. The knowledge was here, the people were here, the civilization was here. What 1788 brought was not the beginning of Sydney's history, but a specific violent interruption of a history that had been developing continuously for 65,000 years. There is a field of inquiry called ethnohistory that sits at the intersection of anthropology, history, and linguistics, and whose purpose is to reconstruct the history of peoples whose experiences are not preserved in written documentary records by reading the traces of that history in oral traditions, material culture, ecological patterns, and linguistic evidence. It is painstaking, interpretively demanding, and produces results that are often less definitive than the written historical record allows, but it is the only methodological tool that can reach the periods of human history that predate writing. For the pre-colonial history of the Sydney region, ethnohistory is an essential discipline, and the work done within it over the past half-century has substantially revised the understanding of what the pre-contact Aboriginal civilization of the harbour region actually looked like. The dreaming, or the dreamtime as it is sometimes called in English, is a term used to gesture at an aspect of Aboriginal culture that English does not have adequate vocabulary to describe precisely. The dreaming refers not to a past time in which ancestral events occurred, as the English word dreamtime might imply, but to an ongoing condition of reality in which the ancestral and the present are not separate domains but interpenetrating aspects of a single continuous existence. The stories of the dreaming are not myths in the sense of fictional accounts of the past. They are accounts of the real structure of the world, encoded in narrative form and transmitted through ceremony and performance and landscape, and they contain within them a history of events and processes that extends back to a time when the land itself was being formed. In the Eora dreaming traditions, the formation of Sydney Harbour is itself a subject of narrative. The harbour was created by the travels and actions of ancestral beings whose presence is preserved in the landscape in specific geographic features. Particular headlands, particular rock formations, particular underwater features visible at low tide, all of these are understood as the traces of ancestral activity, and the stories that describe them encode information about the formation of the landscape that, in some instances, corresponds to geological events that the oral tradition could only have preserved through continuous transmission across tens of thousands of years. One of the most striking examples of this kind of deep historical memory in Aboriginal oral tradition is the evidence for the oral preservation of records of sea level changes that occurred at the end of the last ice age, when the rising seas flooded the continental margins and transformed the geography of coastal Australia. The flooding of these coasts, which occurred between approximately 14,000 and 6,000 years ago, as global temperatures rose and ice sheets melted, was a series of catastrophic events on a human scale, drowning landscapes that had been inhabited for thousands of years and forcing the populations who lived on them to retreat to higher ground. Several Aboriginal communities along the Australian coast have oral traditions that appear to preserve memories of these sea level rise events, describing the submersion of lands that are now underwater in language that has been interpreted as referring to specific geographic events rather than to general mythological themes. The Yolngu people of Arnhem Land have such traditions. Communities along the south and southwest coasts have traditions describing the drowning of land that can be correlated with specific phases of sea level rise in those areas. In the Sydney region, the oral traditions of the Eora people include references to the harbour that suggest an awareness of its formation as a relatively recent event in the deep history of the landscape. The harbour is understood, in some traditional accounts, as a formed place, a landscape that came to be through specific processes, rather than having always existed in its current form. This understanding is geologically accurate. The harbour did not always exist. It formed when the sea rose and flooded the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley approximately 10,000 years ago, and the people who were living on the coastal plain that was being flooded watched it happen, and the memory of what they saw was preserved in the oral traditions that their descendants maintained across the following 10,000 years. 10,000 years of oral transmission. The number does not need to be exact to be extraordinary. Even if we discount the earliest layers and accept only the period for which there is the most direct archaeological corroboration, the oral traditions of the Sydney region represent an archive of historical memory that dwarfs anything produced by the written cultures of the ancient world. The oldest written historical records from anywhere in the world, the Sumerian tablets from Mesopotamia, date to approximately 5,000 years before present. The oral traditions of the Eora people are at least twice that old and almost certainly older. The dreaming is not a primitive religion. It is not a naive mythology. It is a sophisticated knowledge system that uses narrative and ceremony and landscape as the medium of transmission for a historical and scientific archive of extraordinary depth and richness, maintained across a span of time that makes all of written human history look brief. When Arthur Phillip arrived in 1788, the knowledge contained in the dreaming traditions of the Eora people was being actively maintained and transmitted through the ceremonies and the teaching structures and the landscape connections of the community. Every elder around the harbour carried in their memory a portion of this archive. Every young person being initiated was receiving a portion of it. The knowledge was alive, operational, and in use. 18 months after the first fleet arrived, the smallpox epidemic killed half the people who held that knowledge. In the following decades, the survivors were displaced from their country, their children were removed from their families, their ceremonies were suppressed, and the transmission of the knowledge was systematically disrupted in ways from which it has never fully recovered. The loss is not abstract, it is specific. There are specific things that were known about this harbour and this landscape and this sky that are no longer known because the people who knew them died before they could pass the knowledge on, or because the processes of transmission were severed before they could be completed. That knowledge is gone. Not suppressed, not hidden, not waiting to be recovered from an archive. Gone. What remains is still extraordinary because the knowledge system that was damaged was extraordinary enough that even in its damaged state, it retains more than 2 centuries of determined neglect has been able to remove. The rock art is still there, the oral traditions are still being maintained in reduced and damaged form by the community members who have dedicated their lives to their preservation. The language is being taught to children. The ceremonies are being revived. The connections to country are being renewed through the tireless work of Aboriginal people who understand what is at stake. This is what the standard account of Sydney's founding leaves out. Not just the knowledge itself, but the scale of the loss and the magnitude of what remains despite the loss, and the ongoing work of survival and recovery and renewal that has been happening every day for 236 years in the communities whose country this city was built on. There is a particular quality of light in Sydney Harbour in the hour before dawn. The water goes from black to a deep blue-grey that has no exact name in English, and the sandstone of the headlands catches the first pale skylight in the east and holds it differently on different surfaces, depending on their angle and composition and the degree to which they have been worked or worn. In that light, in that hour, the harbour looks ancient in a way that the daytime does not quite capture, because the daytime fills with activity and noise and the visual languages of the present, and the pre-dawn hour is quiet enough that the deep time of the place can become perceptible. The sandstone has been in its current form for approximately 250 million years. The harbour has been in its current form for approximately 10,000 years. The people who have been living on its shores have been there for at least 65,000 years. The city that has been built on top of all of this has been there for 236 years. These numbers are not just statistics. They are an invitation to a different way of thinking about what Sydney is and what it means and what it rests on. The question that this entire journey has been building toward is not whether something was here before 1788. We have established through 9 different lines of evidence and argument that something was very much here before 1788. The question is what it means that the official story of Sydney does not begin there, and what it would mean to reorient the story so that it does. The name Sydney is itself a colonial imposition, assigned by Arthur Phillip in honour of Thomas Townshend, the first Viscount Sydney, the British Home Secretary who authorised and oversaw the establishment of the penal colony. Townshend had a career in British politics and never set foot in the country that carries his title. His name sits on a harbour that already had a name, that had been named by the Cadigal and Eora peoples in a language that Philip's officers struggled to record accurately, in forms that reflect an understanding of the place that no British politician could have possessed. But the renaming is only the surface of the story. The deeper act was the reimagining of the place itself, the transformation in official narrative and in legal doctrine and in the consciousness of the colonial and post-colonial society of what had been an inhabited, managed, named and deeply known landscape into an empty wilderness that had been waiting for European civilization to give it meaning. That transformation was not only morally wrong, though it was that. It was also epistemically costly. Building a city on land without knowing what you are building on produces a city that does not know itself. The streets of Sydney run along routes that are partly determined by the Aboriginal pathways that preceded them, and partly determined by the constraints of the sandstone topography, and partly determined by the administrative decisions of governors and surveyors who had no knowledge of either. The city is a palimpsest, a surface on which multiple histories are written, and only the most recent one is visible to casual reading. The work of making those earlier histories visible has been ongoing for decades, driven by Aboriginal scholars and community leaders and advocates who have insisted that the full history of this place be acknowledged, and that the relationship between the colonial city and the civilization it displaced be confronted honestly. It has also been driven by non-Aboriginal historians and archaeologists who have recognized that the impoverished version of pre-colonial history offered by the founding mythology serves no one well, including the descendants of the colonists who built the city, and whose understanding of where they live is falsified by the myth of 1788 as a beginning. The sites we have visited in this journey are not distant from the city. They are in it and around it and underneath it. The Ku-ring-gai rock engravings are within an hour's drive of the CBD. The soil layers that document thousands of years of occupation are under the footpaths of the central business district. The oral traditions of the Eora people are still being transmitted in community meetings and school programs, and cultural centres within the city limits. The language is being spoken in buildings that stand on the land it was developed to describe. The harbour that Caddy knows is the same harbour that Port Jackson describes. The water is the same water, the sandstone is the same sandstone. The sky over the heads at dawn is the same sky that every dawn for 65,000 years has revealed to the people who were already there. What is different is the story we tell about it, and stories can be changed. Not by ignoring what came before, but by starting the account at the actual beginning rather than at the moment that was convenient for the people who were writing the founding myth. The actual beginning is 65,000 years ago, in the Majid Bebi rock shelter and in the coastal plain that is now the floor of the Tasman Sea, and in the minds of the ancestors who first walked down to the harbour, that would eventually be called Wakamagali, and looked at the water and understood that they had arrived at a place where it would be possible to live very well for a very long time. They were right about that. They lived there very well for a very long time. They built something over that time that the word civilization is not quite adequate to describe, because the word civilization carries connotations of the specifically European forms of social organization that colonial ideology used as the measure of all human achievement. And what was built in the Sydney region over 65,000 years was not a European civilization. It was something that the European category does not contain, something more durable and more complex and more adapted to its specific landscape than most of what the European concept of civilization has produced. It is the presence of that something, built over 65,000 years in the sandstone and the harbour and the knowledge systems and the oral traditions of the Eora people, that 1788 arrived to find. Not emptiness, not wilderness, not a blank page waiting to be written on. A fully realised human world that the arriving culture did not have the frameworks to perceive, and the arriving legal system did not have the honesty to acknowledge. The sandstone knows, the harbour knows, the sky knows. And with each year that passes, and with each conversation and each excavation and each language class and each ceremony and each act of acknowledgement, and each honest reading of what the journals actually say rather than what the myth requires them to say, the story of what was already here becomes a little more audible to the ears of the city that was built on top of it. Paramatta sits 23 kilometres west of Sydney Harbour, at the head of tidal navigation on the Paramatta River. It was the second settlement established by the British colony, chosen in 1789 because the soil around it was more suitable for agriculture than the thin, sandy coastal soils of the Sydney Cove area, and because the river gave it access to the harbour while offering a more sheltered and controllable location for the expanding settlement. The Aboriginal name for the place was Paramatta, meaning the place where the eels sit down, or in some translations, the head of the waters. The Burramadigal people were the clan of the Darug nation whose country this was, and their relationship with the river and the wetlands and the woodland country around it was one of the most productive and long-standing human ecological relationships in the Sydney region. The eels that gave the place its name were not an incidental resource. They were a central element of the food economy of the Burramadigal and their neighbours, managed and harvested using techniques of considerable sophistication. The tidal river and its connected wetlands were managed to maintain eel populations, with specific sections of the river designated for different harvesting methods at different times of year. The knowledge required to manage an eel fishery at this level of intensity, to understand the relationship between tidal patterns and eel behaviour, between water temperature and eel movement, between the condition of the river and the sustainability of the harvest, is knowledge that takes generations to develop and requires both systematic observation and the capacity to transmit what has been observed to the next generation with sufficient precision to be usable. When the colonial settlement at Paramatta was established in 1789, the Burramadigal were still actively using the river system in the ways they had been using it for thousands of years. The smallpox epidemic of 1789 to 1790, which had devastated the harbour communities, had also struck the Paramatta area, reducing the Burramadigal population severely. But the survivors maintained their connection to country and continued to use the river and the surrounding landscape in the traditional ways until the expansion of the colonial settlement made those uses increasingly impossible. The colonial site at Paramatta, which became the centre of agricultural production for the early colony, was developed on and around an existing Aboriginal landscape that had been managed for purposes that were not identical to, but were in significant ways compatible with the agricultural intentions of the colonists. The land was open and park-like in character, a product of the fire management practices of the Burramadigal, and this openness was noted by the early colonial surveyors as a characteristic that made it attractive for farming. They were observing the landscape that had been produced by Aboriginal management without recognizing the management that had produced it. The specific sites of Aboriginal occupation and cultural activity around Paramatta were, in most cases, not investigated archaeologically before colonial development covered them. The movement of settlement and agriculture across the Paramatta Basin in the 1790s and early 1800s was rapid and unregulated in terms of cultural heritage, and the evidence that lay in the soil was not treated as information of historical significance, but as impediment to agricultural production. What has been recovered from the Paramatta area through various archaeological investigations conducted in more recent decades documents an occupation history that extends back thousands of years on every site that has been properly examined. The old government house, the oldest surviving public building in Australia, and now a UNESCO World Heritage listed site, was built in 1799 on a site that had been used by Aboriginal people for purposes that the colonial builders neither investigated nor acknowledged. Excavations around the building have produced Aboriginal artefacts and evidence of Aboriginal occupation from the pre-contact period, layers that the construction of the government house and the subsequent 2 centuries of use and modification left buried beneath but did not entirely destroy. The story of Paramatta's pre-colonial history is the story of Sydney's pre-colonial history in miniature and in somewhat more concentrated form, because the richness of the Paramatta area's ecological resources, the river, the wetlands, the fertile volcanic and alluvial soils to the west, made it a particularly intensive site of Aboriginal occupation and management. The depth and density of the archaeological record that lies beneath the modern city of Paramatta has not been fully investigated and may never be, given the degree of disturbance that 2 centuries of intensive urban development have caused. But what exists in the ground is still there, and what exists in the oral traditions and the cultural knowledge of the Burramadigal and Darug descendants, who have maintained their connection to this country through the colonial period and beyond, is also still there. And together they describe a place whose history as a human settlement makes Paramatta one of the most continuously occupied sites in Australian history, in a history that begins decades and centuries before any European arrived to name it. The Paramatta River is still tidal. The eels are still there. The river still follows the course that the Burramadigal knew, though its edges have been hardened and its banks developed and its flow managed in ways that reduce the complexity and productivity of the system that the traditional management maintained. The memory of what the river was is held by the community members who carry the knowledge of it, and in the name Paramatta itself, which every tram and train service and government document in the region uses daily, unknowingly invoking the language of the people whose knowledge of this place is as deep as the river that named the city. South of the harbour, in the country of the Darowal people, the sandstone landscape takes on a character that differs subtly but distinctly from the Hawkesbury sandstone country to the north and west. The plateaus are broader and more exposed. The coastline is more dramatic, with sea cliffs that drop directly into the Tasman Sea in long, unbroken lines. The wind off the ocean has been working on the sandstone for longer, and the resulting landscape has a quality of exposure, of nakedness almost, that makes the engravings found there feel somehow more significant rather than less, as if the people who made them were making a statement against the weather rather than in collaboration with the shelter of the bush. The Darowal country extends from the George River in the north to roughly the Shoalhaven in the south, and it includes some of the most remarkable archaeological sites in the Sydney region. The Royal National Park, established in 1879 as the second national park in the world after Yellowstone, sits within Darowal country, and within its boundaries there are rock art sites, shell middens, and archaeological deposits that document the Darowal people's occupation and use of this coast across thousands of years. The Darowal people maintain distinct cultural practices from the Eora people of the harbour, though the two communities were connected by kinship and trade relationships and shared elements of the broader coastal cultural tradition of southeastern Australia. The Darowal language was distinct from the harbour Eora languages, sufficiently so that early colonial observers noted the need for separate communication efforts. The cultural practices associated with the coast, with the management of the coastal heath and the cliff country, with the harvesting of marine resources from exposed surf coast environments, were adapted to conditions different from those of the sheltered harbour. The rock art of the Darowal country includes some of the finest and most formally organised engraving sites in the Sydney region. The Bulgandry site in the Brisbane Water National Park, which contains the engravings associated with the Gosford glyphs controversy discussed earlier in this journey, also contains a large male figure of remarkable formal quality, one of the most accomplished human representations in the Sydney Basin rock art tradition, whose positioning and orientation within the site suggest a deliberately staged relationship with the landscape around it. The Darowal people's understanding of the sea was among the most sophisticated bodies of ecological knowledge in pre-colonial Australia. The surf coast of their country is one of the most productive marine environments in temperate Australia, but it is also one of the most dangerous, with strong swells, unpredictable currents, and exposure to weather that makes the harvesting of marine resources a technically demanding enterprise requiring detailed knowledge of conditions and a high degree of practical skill. The Darowal maintained knowledge of the behavior of particular species across seasons and conditions, of the specific locations within the coastal zone where particular resources were available at particular times, of the weather patterns that indicated safe and unsafe conditions for coastal harvesting, and of the management practices that maintained the productivity of the intertidal and subtidal zones over time. This knowledge was accumulated across generations through the same processes of systematic observation and oral transmission that produced the ecological knowledge of the harbour communities, and it represented an understanding of the coastal environment that marine biologists are still working to reconstruct using the methods of modern science. The relationship between the Darowal people and the coast they managed is preserved in the landscape itself in ways that are still partially readable. The middens that mark the sites of long-term occupation along the coast contain within them a record of what was eaten across hundreds and thousands of years, and by extension a record of what was available, and by further extension a record of how the marine environment changed over the period of human occupation. This kind of long-duration ecological record is invaluable for understanding baseline ecological conditions, the state of the marine environment before industrial-scale harvesting altered it, and it can only be read from the archaeological record of the communities that lived with that environment over the relevant timescales. Several researchers working with Darowal knowledge holders, and with the shell midden record of the South Coast, have been attempting to reconstruct aspects of this baseline ecological knowledge. The work is slow and requires both the trust of the community and the patience of the researcher, because the most complete knowledge exists in the oral traditions of the community rather than in any published source, and accessing it appropriately requires the development of genuine relationships of respect and reciprocity. But the work is being done, and what it is producing is a picture of the south coast of the Sydney region as a managed marine environment of considerable sophistication, maintained by people who understood its dynamics at a level that current marine science, for all its technical sophistication, is still in some respects working to match. The Darowal coast knew human hands long before any European ship appeared on its horizon. The hands that worked the sandstone into art and managed the intertidal zone for harvest and maintained the coastal heath through fire were connected to minds that understood this particular piece of the world with a completeness and a depth that the word knowledge does not quite capture, because the Darowal relationship with their country was not primarily a relationship of knowing but of being, of existing as a part of a landscape rather than as an observer and manager of it. That is perhaps the deepest thing about the pre-colonial history of the Sydney region, that the colonial narrative has been most unable to accommodate. Not the specific facts of what was built or managed or known, though those facts are remarkable enough, but the different relationship with place that those facts express. The understanding that country is not a resource, but a reality, not something to be used, but something to be in relationship with, not something that exists for human benefit, but something that humans are part of. That understanding was operating here for 65,000 years before 1788. It is still operating in the minds and hearts and cultural practices of the Aboriginal people of the Sydney region, in the face of everything that has been done to extinguish it. And it is an understanding that the city that was built without it increasingly needs, as the consequences of building without it become more apparent with each decade. The construction of modern Sydney has been, in a sense, an ongoing archaeological excavation conducted without archaeologists. Every time a foundation is dug for a new building, every time a road is cut through bedrock, every time a tunnel is bored through the sandstone, the machinery and the workers encounter the accumulated physical record of what was here before. In most cases, the encounter is brief. The construction schedule does not allow for extended investigation. What is found is noted, sometimes photographed, occasionally sampled, and then covered over by the new construction that the project requires. The result is a city whose foundations rest on layers of history that its residents largely do not know about, and that its official accounts do not systematically record. The Circular Quay area, the most visited and symbolically central part of Sydney, is also one of the most archaeologically layered. The original shoreline of Sydney Cove was significantly further inland than the current waterfront, and the process of land reclamation that pushed the shoreline to its present position began in the early colonial period and continued intermittently through the 19th and early 20th centuries. Beneath the reclaimed land and beneath the original colonial foreshores, the sandstone bedrock carries the traces of its pre-contact use in forms that are mostly invisible under the modern urban surface. The Tank Stream, which runs beneath the central business district from its source in the uplands now occupied by Hyde Park to its outlet at Circular Quay, has been the object of historical attention because of its significance to the founding of the colonial settlement. But the archaeological investigation of the corridor through which it runs has been less systematic than the historical interest would warrant. What has been found in the various investigations and incidental exposures of the stream channel and its surrounds over the years includes Aboriginal artifacts, evidence of the managed landscape that preceded colonial construction, and, in at least one case, material that suggested use of the area that may predate the main colonial occupation. The Hyde Park area itself, which serves as the city's central green space and has done so since the early colonial period, contains within its soil layers an archaeological record that extends back to the pre-contact period. The park was used as a cattle grazing area, a racecourse, a military parade ground, and finally a formal public park in its colonial and post-colonial history, and each of these uses disturbed and partially destroyed the earlier layers. But in the areas that have been investigated, material from the pre-contact period is consistently found in the deeper stratigraphic levels. The specific Aboriginal heritage sites that were documented in the early colonial period around the area of the modern central business district have almost all been physically destroyed by subsequent development. The cleared ceremonial ground that early observers noted near the stream that became the Tank Stream was built over in the first years of the settlement. The rock art that Tench and other early observers described in the vicinity of the settlement has not survived, presumably destroyed by construction or quarrying in the early colonial period before systematic documentation was possible. What survives is the record in the stone itself, because the sandstone cannot be made to forget what was done to it. The quarrying operations of the early colonial period produced, in the areas of greatest activity, surfaces that show the progression from Aboriginal worked stone to colonial worked stone, in a way that is sometimes physically visible at the boundary between the two operations. The Aboriginal sandstone carvings that were in the path of early quarrying were incorporated into the colonial building program. As raw material, their surfaces obliterated in the process, their prior meaning converted into construction material. This is the most literal version of the story of what happened in 78 and after. The Aboriginal landscape of the Sydney region was literally quarried to provide the material for the colonial city, its worked surfaces buried in walls and foundations, its cultural significance converted into structural utility. The sandstone of the colonial buildings is in many cases the same sandstone that carried Aboriginal engravings before the quarrying began. The city is built from its own prior history, and the history is in the walls, invisible because it was placed in positions where it could not be seen. The archaeology of modern Sydney is a discipline that has made enormous strides in the past 3 decades, driven by the mandatory archaeological assessments that planning law now requires before significant development can proceed. These assessments have produced a body of knowledge about the pre-colonial and early colonial archaeology of the Sydney region that is vastly more detailed than what was available a generation ago. The work of researchers like Val Attenborough, whose archaeological investigations of the Sydney region have produced the most comprehensive published account of the pre-contact archaeology of the area, has fundamentally changed what is knowable about what was here before 1788. Attenborough's synthesis of the archaeological evidence, published in her 2002 book, Sydney's Aboriginal Past, and updated in subsequent editions, documents an occupation history that extends back at least 45,000 years in the Sydney Basin, that involves populations significantly larger and more complex in their social organisation than colonial mythology allowed. And that produced a landscape that was so thoroughly managed and modified by human activity over such an extended period that the distinction between the natural and the cultural environment is, in many respects, artificial. That book exists. It sits in university libraries and public libraries around Sydney. It has been there for more than 2 decades. The city that its subject matter describes goes on being described in school curriculums and popular media, and public discourse as having begun in 1788. And the archaeological record that documents the 65,000 years that preceded that beginning goes on being buried under new foundations and new roads and new developments, whose planning documents include the required heritage assessments and then file them and move on. The gap between what archaeology knows about pre-colonial Sydney and what the city's public culture acknowledges about pre-colonial Sydney is not a gap of knowledge, it is a gap of attention. The knowledge exists. It is published and available and has been produced by diligent and rigorous researchers over many decades. The attention, the collective will to incorporate that knowledge into the story that the city tells about itself, is what has been slower in coming. The question of what was already in Sydney when the British arrived has consequences that extend far beyond historical scholarship. It is a question with political dimensions, legal dimensions, and ethical dimensions that continue to shape the present reality of the city and of the country in which it sits. The legal doctrine of terra nullius, which declared Australia empty and unowned at the moment of British possession, was overturned by the High Court of Australia in the Mabo decision of 1992. The case, brought by Eddie Koiki Mabo and other Meriam people of the Murray Islands in the Torres Strait, established that the common law of Australia does recognise native title, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have rights to their land that derive from their prior occupation and that survive under Australian law. The Mabo decision did not overturn 2 centuries of colonial land grants and dispositions, but it fundamentally altered the legal framework within which the relationship between the Australian state and its Indigenous peoples is understood. The Mabo decision was, in effect, a judicial acknowledgement that something was here before 1788, that the land had owners, that those owners had a legal relationship with their land that deserved recognition, that the founding myth of the empty continent was not simply historically wrong, but legally wrong, and that its legal wrongness had consequences that the Australian legal system was obligated to address. The Native Title Act of 1993, which gave legislative form to the Mabo decision, and the subsequent decades of native title negotiations and determinations across the country, have produced a complex and imperfect but genuine renegotiation of the relationship between the Australian state and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples whose land the state was built on. Native title determinations have been made in the Sydney region, recognising the continuing connection of specific Aboriginal groups to specific areas of their country within the modern city. These determinations do not change the physical landscape of the city. The office towers and the roads and the harbour foreshores continue in their colonial configurations, but they change the legal and symbolic landscape in ways that matter. They are formal acknowledgements made by the Australian judicial system, that the story did not begin in 1788, that there were people here before, that those people had rights that were never validly extinguished, and that the legal system of the country acknowledges and responds to those rights. The welcome to country ceremonies that are now a standard feature of public events across Australia, in which an elder of the local Aboriginal community formally acknowledges their continuing connection to an authority over the country on which the event is being held, are another form of public acknowledgement that something was here before the colonial period. They are ceremonies of recognition, performed in the middle of the modern city on country that has not stopped being country simply because it has been built on, and they invoke a continuity of presence and authority that extends back beyond 1788 to the actual beginning of human occupation in this place. For many people who participate in or observe these ceremonies, they represent an important acknowledgement of historical reality. For others, they remain uncomfortable or perfunctory, the tick of a box rather than a genuine reckoning with what they acknowledge. The gap between the ceremony and the full acknowledgement of what the ceremony represents is still significant. Knowing that Sydney was built on Aboriginal country, that Aboriginal people have a continuous connection to this land, that Aboriginal culture and knowledge and authority over country were here before the colonial city, and remain here alongside it, knowing these things intellectually and having them genuinely shape the way you understand the city you live in are different things. The difference matters because what you do not know about where you live limits your capacity to understand it fully, to care for it appropriately, and to make good decisions about its future. A city that does not know its own history is a city making decisions in partial darkness. The ecological crisis that faces the Greater Sydney region, the degradation of the harbour, the loss of urban biodiversity, the management of water and green space and coastal environments in the face of climate change. These are problems that the city's founding culture created and that the city's current culture is struggling to solve. They are problems that the Aboriginal people of the region did not create and whose solutions may require incorporating the knowledge systems of the people who managed this landscape successfully for 65,000 years. This is not a romanticized claim that pre-colonial management was perfect, or that it can be simply transplanted into the management of a modern city of 5 million people. It is a practical observation that 65,000 years of successful ecological management on a specific landscape constitutes an evidence base that it would be foolish to ignore, particularly at a moment when the methods of management that replaced it are producing demonstrably negative outcomes for the long-term health of that landscape. The harbour is still here, the sandstone is still here, the sky is still here. The knowledge of the people who knew them first is still here, damaged but alive, in the communities and the traditions and the individual knowledge holders who have kept it through everything that was done to extinguish it. And the question of what was already in Sydney when 1788 arrived, the question that opened this long, slow journey through the deep history of one of the most famous harbours in the world, is not ultimately a historical question in the narrow sense. It is a question about what kind of city Sydney is and what kind of city it could be if it knew itself more completely. It is a question about what it means to belong to a place and how long you need to have been there before the belonging becomes real and incontestable, and what it takes for a people to be acknowledged as having built something worth acknowledging on the land they have inhabited. The Eora people built something worth acknowledging. They built it over 65,000 years on a harbour of extraordinary beauty and ecological richness, and they built it with a sophistication and a durability that the colonial city that was imposed on top of it has not yet equalled. The building they did was not in stone and mortar, in the ways that European cities are built, though there was stone and there were engineered structures and there were managed landscapes on a scale that makes the word engineering entirely appropriate. The building they did was in knowledge and in relationship and in the intricate multi-generational work of understanding a specific place so completely that you become inseparable from it. That kind of building lasts. It lasts because it is not built in materials that can be demolished. It is built in the patterns of land and water and sky, in the memory of the people who have moved through those patterns for longer than memory usually reaches, in the language that encodes what has been learned, in the ceremony that transmits it, in the care for country that expresses it. That is what was already there when the sails appeared over the heads in January 1788. That is what Sydney was built on top of. And that is what the sandstone has been holding in patient ancient silence, waiting for the city on its surface to finally ask what lies underneath. There is a particular kind of silence that happens in the bush around Sydney on a still night. The sound of the city drops away more quickly than you expect once you're in it. The bush absorbs and deflects noise with its own complex acoustic properties, and what remains is a quality of quiet that is not absence of sound, but presence of something older than sound. The night birds, the wind in the eucalypts, the movement of animals in the undergrowth that you hear without seeing, the creak of old trees adjusting to the cooling of the air. People who grew up with access to this bush, who walked in it as children and slept in it as adults, describe a particular quality of awareness that it produces, a heightened attention to the immediate physical environment that comes from the absence of the background noise of urban life and the presence of the sounds of the living world that the urban noise was covering. It is the kind of awareness that the Eora people would have lived in continuously, the attentiveness to the physical world that is the prerequisite for the intimate ecological knowledge that characterized pre-colonial Aboriginal culture. You cannot learn a landscape from a distance. You cannot develop the knowledge of the specific water behaviors of a particular harbour, the specific movement patterns of fish at specific tidal stages, the specific relationship between the flowering of particular plants and the availability of particular animal species, without being in the landscape with that quality of attention, consistently, over a long time. The knowledge that the Eora people developed about the Sydney region was not theoretical knowledge or abstract knowledge. It was embodied, attentive, presence-based knowledge, the kind that comes from spending your life in a place with your senses fully engaged with what it is doing. The orientation of the modern city toward the interior, the way that urban life organizes sensory experience around manufactured environments and mediated information rather than direct environmental attention, is perhaps the deepest structural reason why the pre-colonial history of Sydney remains so invisible to so many of the people who live there. Not because the information is unavailable, it is more available than it has ever been, but because the habits of attention that would allow it to be received and integrated are not cultivated by urban life in the way that the habits of attention that allowed the Eora people to develop their knowledge were cultivated by their life in the landscape. The work of recovering and reconnecting to the pre-colonial history of Sydney is partly the work of recovering that quality of attention, of learning to look at the sandstone and see not just building material but record, of learning to look at the harbour and see not just scenery but managed ecology, of learning to walk along a headland at night and feel the deep time of the place as something present and real rather than as an abstract historical fact. The Eora people did not think of their relationship with country as history. They thought of it as ongoing, as present tense, as the current reality of their existence. The ancestors whose actions shaped the landscape are not the past in the Eora understanding of things. They are the continuing presence that makes the landscape what it is. The knowledge of the landscape is not historical knowledge. It is knowledge of what is actually here now, encoded in the rock and the water and the sky, readable by the people who know how to read it. This is the most profound thing that the deep history of the Sydney region offers to the city that was built on top of it. Not just the historical fact of prior occupation, not just the archaeological evidence of prior sophistication, not just the ethical imperative to acknowledge what was destroyed and what was taken. Those things are important and real. But the deepest offering is the alternative relationship with place that the pre-colonial history represents. The possibility of knowing a specific piece of the world with the completeness and the care and the temporal depth that the Eora people knew this harbour. Sydney Harbour is one of the most beautiful and significant places on Earth. It is beautiful in the obvious ways, the play of light on the water, the drama of the sandstone cliffs, the complexity of the coastline with its bays and headlands and inlets. But it is significant in ways that go beyond the obvious, in the depth of the human history that is accumulated on its shores and in the stone below them, in the knowledge systems that were developed here over 65,000 years, in the living culture of the Aboriginal people who continue to be the custodians of country that the colonial city was built on without asking permission. Understanding that significance, really understanding it in a way that changes how you see the harbour when you look at it, is the work that this long, slow journey has been pointing toward. Not the work of a single video or a single book or a single conversation, but the work of sustained and honest attention to a place that has more to offer than the founding myth has allowed. The ledge of sandstone above the waterline, the one we began with, the one worn smooth in ways that stone does not wear smooth on its own, with grooves too regular and too deep for anything but human intention, is still there. It has been there since before the harbour had a European name, since before there was a city on its shores, since before the flags and the buildings and the roads and the noise. It will be there after the city has been replaced by whatever comes next, holding in its work surface the record of the hands that shaped it, the intention that guided those hands, the knowledge that made the intention possible. That is what Sydney was built on. That is what was already there. And that is enough, more than enough, to begin a different kind of conversation about what this place is and what it could become if the city on its surface finally learned to listen to the stone beneath its feet. The sandstone knows, it has always known. It carries in its grain and its surface and its worked edges the record of everything that has been done to it and everything that has been done near it across a span of time that the mind cannot fully hold, but that the body can sometimes feel. Standing on it in the right light at the right hour when the city is quiet and the water is still and the old stone beneath your feet is doing what it has always done, which is simply being here, unchanged in its essential nature by anything that has been built on top of it. The harbour knows too. The water moving through the heads on the incoming tide carries with it the memory of every tide that has moved through those heads since the sea rose to fill the drowned valley 10,000 years ago. Each tide is different and each tide is the same. And the sameness is the continuity of a place that has been itself across a span of time that no political act of naming or claiming has altered. The people know. The Eora people, the Gadigal and the Wangal and the Camaragal and the Cadigal and the Darug and the Darowal and the Gundungurra and the Darkinjung and the Paramatta and all the others, whose country constitutes what we now call the Greater Sydney region. They know this place in a way that 236 years of colonial imposition has not erased and cannot erase. They carry the knowledge in their bodies and their families and their communities and their ceremonies. They are here. They have been here, they were here first. That is the whole story, and it is a story that the sandstone carved with the patience of deep time. Sydney was not built in 1788. Sydney was found in 1788. What it found was a city of a different kind, older and quieter, and deeper than anything the arriving ships were carrying, already built into the stone and the water and the knowledge of the people who had been making it, carefully and with great deliberation, for 65,000 years.